lost everything because of a lie. Now, the very person who destroyed her life stands before her, not as an enemy, but as someone asking for her forgiveness. What happened in between? And why now, after everything, does he come back? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The cold autumn wind swept through the stone corridors of Blackmore Castle, carrying with it the scent of rain and dying leaves. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood before the great hall's towering oak doors, her heart pounding against her ribcage like a prisoner desperate for freedom. The heavy wool of her deep burgundy gown, richly embroidered with golden thread along the bodice and sleeves, did little to ward off the chill that had settled into her bones. The dress was layered with a darker underskirt visible through the slashes in the fabric, and a thick leather belt cinched her waist, from which hung a small pouch embroidered with her family's crest. Over her shoulders draped a fur-lined cloak of charcoal gray, fastened at her throat with an ornate silver brooch shaped like a soaring hawk. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she smoothed down the fabric of her gown, a nervous habit she had developed over the years at court. Her long auburn hair, usually worn in elaborate braids befitting her station as a lady of noble birth, now hung in a simple plait over her shoulder, a few rebellious strands framing her face. Her green eyes, the color of spring moss after rain, held a mixture of apprehension and determination. At 23 years of age, she had learned to mask her emotions well, but today, fear threatened to crack the careful facade she had built. The doors swung open with a groan that echoed through the vaulted ceiling, and Eleanor stepped into the great hall. The space was vast and imposing, with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and ancient battles hanging from the stone walls. Torches flickered in their iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the floor. At the far end of the hall, seated upon an elevated dais, was King Edward of House Thornwick, a man whose reputation for swift justice and quicker temper preceded him throughout the kingdom. The king sat in a high-backed chair carved from dark oak, his broad shoulders filling the space with an authority that needed no crown to be recognized. Though he wore no ceremonial robes today, his presence dominated the room. Edward Thornwick was a man in his late 20s, with strong, chiseled features that spoke of his warrior heritage. His dark hair fell to his shoulders in waves, and his gray eyes, sharp as steel, surveyed the hall with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to trust no one. He wore a tunic of deep forest green, layered over a shirt of fine linen, with leather bracers on his forearms and a thick belt from which hung a sword in an ornately decorated scabbard. A heavy cloak of wolf fur draped across the back of his chair, speaking to both his status and the bitter cold that permeated the castle. To the king's right stood his chief adviser, Lord Marcus Blackwood, a thin man with hawkish features and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His robes were of fine black wool, trimmed with silver thread, and he held a leather-bound ledger against his chest as though it contained the secrets of the kingdom itself. To the king's left stood Lady Vivian Ashford, Eleanor's cousin by marriage, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition. Vivian wore a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her figure, with sleeves that trailed nearly to the floor, and a neckline embroidered with pearls and sapphires. Her black hair was arranged in an intricate series of braids wound around her head like a crown, and her dark eyes glittered with something Eleanor had learned to recognize as malice disguised as concern. Eleanor walked forward, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the assembled courtiers. Men and women in their finest attire lined the walls, their faces a mixture of curiosity, pity, and schadenfreude. She could feel their stares like physical touches, could hear the whispers that followed in her wake like the hiss of serpents in tall grass. When she reached the appropriate distance from the dais, Eleanor sank into a deep curtsy, her head bowed low. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging within her chest. "I come as summoned." King Edward leaned forward slightly, his fingers drumming against the carved armrest of his chair. His expression was unreadable, a mask of regal composure that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Lady Eleanor Ashford," he began, his voice deep and resonant, filling every corner of the hall. "You stand accused of a most grievous crime. It has been brought to our attention that you have conspired to poison Lady Vivian, your own family, with intent to claim her lands and titles for yourself. A collective gasp rose from the assembled court, though Eleanor suspected that most already knew of the accusation. Court gossip traveled faster than horses, after all. She raised her head, meeting the king's gaze directly, something few dared to do. "Your Majesty, I swear upon my family's honor and my own life that these accusations are utterly false. I have never harbored ill will toward Lady Vivian, nor have I ever contemplated such a heinous act." Vivian stepped forward then, her hand pressed dramatically to her bosom, her face a perfect picture of wounded distress. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion to those who did not know her well. "How can you stand there and deny what has been proven? The evidence speaks for itself. The vial of poison found in your chambers, the testimony of your own maidservant who saw you mixing strange concoctions in the dead of night, the very fact that I fell gravely ill after dining at your table just 3 days past." Eleanor felt her composure waver for just a moment. The accusations were lies, every single one of them, but they had been crafted with such careful precision that they formed a web from which she could see no escape. "The vial was planted in my chambers," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I know not by whom, but I swear I have never seen it before the guards discovered it. As for my maidservant, Sarah has been in Lady Vivian's employ for the past month. She was recommended to me by my cousin herself. Does that not strike anyone as suspicious?" Lord Blackwood cleared his throat, his thin lips curving into what might have been a smile on a more generous face. "My lady, are you suggesting that Lady Vivian orchestrated her own poisoning? That she would risk her own life to frame you for a crime you did not commit? That seems rather far-fetched, does it not?" Eleanor turned her attention to the advisor, seeing in his eyes the same calculation she had observed in Vivienne's. They were working together, she realized with a sinking heart. This was no simple accusation born of misunderstanding or coincidence. This was a carefully planned conspiracy, and she had been too blind to see it coming until the trap had already closed around her. "I know how it sounds," Eleanor said, forcing herself to remain calm. "But I also know the truth. Lady Vivian has long coveted the lands that came to me through my mother's line. The Ashford estates are prosperous and strategically positioned along the northern trade routes. With me disgraced or executed, those lands would revert to the crown, and His Majesty might see fit to grant them to a loyal courtier, perhaps one who has proven herself a victim of treachery." King Edward's expression darkened at her words, and Eleanor immediately regretted her boldness. To suggest that he might be swayed by such machinations was to question his judgment, and that was a dangerous game to play. The king rose from his chair, his imposing height making him tower over the assembly. He descended the steps of the dais with measured strides, each footfall deliberate and heavy with authority. "You dare to suggest that we would allow ourselves to be manipulated in such a manner?" the king demanded, his voice cold as winter frost. "You forget yourself, Lady Eleanor. You stand accused of attempted murder, and yet you seek to turn the blame upon your accuser. Where is your proof? Where are your witnesses? You have nothing but your word, and the word of one who would commit such treachery is worth less than dust." Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, felt the careful world she had built crumbling around her. She had no proof, no witnesses who would speak in her favor. Sarah, her maidservant, had already testified against her, and the other servants had either been dismissed or were too frightened to speak. Her parents were long dead, victims of a fever that had swept through the kingdom 5 years prior, and she had no siblings to stand beside her. She was utterly alone. "Your Majesty, I beseech you," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly despite her best efforts to maintain her composure. "Grant me time to prove my innocence. Allow me to investigate these charges, to find those who would testify to my character and my actions. I am a loyal subject of the crown. I have never given you cause to doubt my fealty." The king stopped just a few paces from her, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he were looking into her very soul. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence stretched between them like a taut thread ready to snap. Eleanor could see something flickering in his gaze, something that might have been doubt or perhaps curiosity, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by the cold mask of royal judgment. "You speak of loyalty," King Edward said quietly, his voice carrying nonetheless to every corner of the hall. "Yet loyalty means nothing when weighed against evidence of betrayal. The vial of poison was found in your possession. Your servant has testified to your suspicious behavior. Lady Vivian herself nearly died from ingesting whatever foul concoction you prepared. These are facts, Lady Eleanor, not mere suppositions or courtly gossip. Vivian moved to stand beside the king, her expression one of sorrowful resignation. Your Majesty, though it pains me greatly to see my cousin brought so low, I must think of the safety of your realm. If Eleanor is capable of attempting to poison me, what might she do to others? To you even? I know you are merciful, but mercy must sometimes give way to justice. Eleanor wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice of it all, but she knew that any display of emotion would only be used against her. Instead, she straightened her spine and met the king's gaze once more. Then, if I am to be condemned, let it be done swiftly, she said, her voice steady once more. But know this, Your Majesty, the truth has a way of revealing itself, and when it does, those who have perpetrated this fraud will face their own reckoning. King Edward's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something flash in his eyes that might have been respect. But then he turned away, ascending the dais once more to reclaim his seat. He gestured to Lord Blackwood, who stepped forward with his ledger, preparing to record the king's judgment. Lady Eleanor Ashford, the king proclaimed, his voice ringing out with the weight of absolute authority. We find that the evidence against you is substantial and damning. However, in recognition of your family's long service to the crown and the lack of any previous transgression on your part, we are inclined toward mercy. You are hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and holdings. The Ashford estates are forfeit to the crown. You are banished from this kingdom, never to return upon pain of death. You have until sunset tomorrow to gather your belongings and depart. Should you be found within our borders after that time, you will be executed without trial. This is our final judgment. The pronouncement fell upon Eleanor like a physical blow. Banishment meant exile, wandering, uncertainty, and danger. A woman alone on the roads without protection or means was vulnerable to every manner of threat. But it was better than execution, she told herself. At least she would have her life, and where there was life, there was hope. She curtsied deeply once more, her legs trembling with the effort of remaining upright. Thank you for your mercy, Your Majesty, she managed to say, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. As she turned to leave, she caught Vivian's eye. Her cousin's expression was triumphant, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Eleanor committed that look to memory, filing it away alongside all the other slights and betrayals she had endured. She would survive this. She would find a way to prove her innocence. And one day, perhaps, she would return to see justice served. The walk back through the great hall seemed to take an eternity. The courtiers parted before her like a sea, their faces turned away, as though her disgrace might be contagious. Eleanor kept her head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She had learned long ago that in the world of court politics, showing weakness was tantamount to inviting destruction. When she finally emerged into the cold autumn air, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the sting of tears that she had refused to shed in front of her enemies. The sky above was heavy with clouds, promising rain before nightfall. The wind whipped at her cloak, and she pulled it tighter around her shoulders, already feeling the weight of her uncertain future pressing down upon her. A voice from behind startled her from her thoughts. "My lady." Eleanor turned to find a young man approaching, dressed in the simple wool tunic and leather vest of a castle guard. He was perhaps 20 years of age, with sandy brown hair and kind eyes. She recognized him as Thomas, one of the guards who had always treated her with respect, even when others had begun to whisper behind her back. "Thomas," she acknowledged, her voice weary, "have you come to ensure I do not flee before my appointed time of departure?" The young guard shook his head, glancing around nervously to ensure they were not overheard. "No, my lady. I came to tell you that I do not believe the accusations against you. I have served in this castle for 5 years, and I have seen you show nothing but kindness to all, regardless of their station. Lady Vivian, on the other hand." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable, speaking ill of a noblewoman. Eleanor felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, the first since this nightmare had begun. "Thank you, Thomas. Your words mean more to me than you know, but I fear that belief alone will not save me now." Thomas reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather pouch, pressing it into her hands. "It is not much, my lady, but it is all I could gather. Some coin for your journey, and a letter of introduction to my uncle who keeps an inn along the northern road. He is a good man and will offer you shelter without asking questions." Tears threatened to spill over, but Eleanor blinked them back. "I cannot accept this. You will need it yourself, and if anyone discovers you helped me, then let them discover it." Thomas interrupted gently. "Some things are worth the risk, my lady. You showed kindness to my sister when she was ill last winter, visiting her in the servants' quarters and bringing her medicine from your own supplies. You did not have to do that. You did it because it was right. Please let me do this small thing in return." Eleanor clutched the pouch to her chest, nodding slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will not forget this kindness." As Thomas melted back into the shadows of the castle, Eleanor turned her face toward the darkening sky. Tomorrow she would leave everything she had ever known behind. She would step into uncertainty with nothing but her wits and the kindness of a young guard to sustain her. But she would survive. She had to. Because somewhere in the tangled web of lies and betrayal, there was truth waiting to be uncovered, and Eleanor Ashford was determined to find it. The morning of Eleanor's departure arrived shrouded in mist, the kind that clung to the ground like a living thing and turned the world into a realm of shadows and whispers. She had spent the night packing what few belongings she was permitted to take, her hands moving mechanically through the motions while her mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The castle servants had been forbidden from helping her, but several had defied the order in small ways, leaving bread wrapped in cloth outside her door, or a warm cloak folded on her bed when she returned from a final walk through the gardens she had loved. Eleanor stood now in the courtyard, dressed for travel in a simple gown of dark gray wool, far plainer than anything she had worn in years. Over it she wore the charcoal cloak Thomas had given her, lined with rabbit fur and sturdy enough to withstand the autumn rains. Her auburn hair was braided tightly and wound around her head, then covered with a hood to protect against the elements. At her waist hung a leather belt with a small dagger, more for utility than defense, and the pouch Thomas had given her, now slightly heavier thanks to a few additional coins she had managed to hide from the guards who had inventoried her possessions. A single horse had been provided for her journey, a gray mare past her prime but sturdy enough for the roads. Eleanor had always been an accomplished rider, a skill her father had insisted she learn, despite her mother's protests that it was unladylike. Now she was grateful for his foresight. The mare stood patiently as Eleanor secured her small pack of belongings to the saddle, her movements practiced and efficient. "Leaving so soon, cousin?" The voice sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. She turned to find Vivian approaching across the courtyard, her dark blue gown pristine despite the morning damp, a satisfied smile playing across her beautiful features. Behind her walked two of her ladies-in-waiting, their expressions carefully neutral. Eleanor straightened, refusing to be intimidated. "I have until sunset, as decreed by His Majesty, but I see no reason to linger where I am not wanted." Vivian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "How noble of you." "Tell me, Eleanor, do you finally understand? All those years you spent at court with your virtue and your kindness, thinking yourself above the games the rest of us played. Did you truly believe that goodness alone would protect you?" "I believed that truth would prevail," Eleanor replied quietly. "I still do." "Truth?" Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice so that only Eleanor could hear. "Truth is whatever people choose to believe. And I have made them believe that you are a poisoner and a traitor. Your truth died the moment that vial was found in your chamber." Eleanor felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did I ever do to deserve such hatred from you? We are family, Vivian. Our mothers were sisters." Vivian's eyes flashed with something dark and cold. "Family?" she hissed. "You, who inherited the Ashford lands when by rights they should have gone to me. My mother was the elder sister, yet because she married a second son while yours married the heir, you received everything. The estates, the wealth, the respect. Do you know what it is like to watch someone younger, someone less deserving, receive what should be yours?" "The inheritance laws were not of my making," Eleanor said. "I would have shared with you, Vivian. You had only to ask." "I do not want your charity," Vivian spat. "I want what is mine, and now I have it. The king has already promised me the Ashford estates in recognition of my suffering at your hands. By this time next month I will be mistress of the lands that should have been mine from the beginning." Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her, So that was the true motive behind all of this. Not simple malice or court intrigue, but greed and envy that had festered for years until it had poisoned Vivian's heart completely. "You poisoned yourself," Eleanor said suddenly, the realization striking her like a thunderbolt. "That is why you recovered so quickly. You knew exactly what you had taken and how much would make you ill without truly endangering your life." Vivian's smile widened. "Clever girl. But it hardly matters now, does it? Who would believe you? A disgraced exile over a noble lady who nearly died at her cousin's hand? No one, Eleanor. Absolutely no one." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion at the castle gates drew their attention. A group of riders was approaching, their horses' hooves clattering against the cobblestones. At their head rode King Edward himself, dressed in traveling clothes of dark leather and wool, a heavy cloak of deep green fastened at his shoulder with a silver clasp. His presence was unexpected, and Eleanor felt her heart quicken with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The king dismounted with fluid grace, his expression unreadable as always. He nodded curtly to Vivian, who curtsied deeply, then turned his attention to Eleanor. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his deep voice carrying across the courtyard. "Or perhaps I should simply say Eleanor, as you no longer hold title or rank." Eleanor curtsied as well, though not as deeply as Vivian had. "Your Majesty, I did not expect to see you this morning. We have decided to ride out with our hunting party," Edward said, gesturing to the men behind him. "The morning seemed favorable despite the mist, and we thought to take advantage of it. But seeing you here has reminded us of a matter we wished to address before your departure." Eleanor's mouth went dry. Had he changed his mind? Was he going to have her executed after all? She waited, hardly daring to breathe, as the king studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. "It has occurred to us," Edward continued slowly, "that sending a woman alone onto the roads with nothing but a horse and a few belongings is perhaps more harsh than the crime warranted, even if we believed you guilty. Therefore, we have arranged for an escort to accompany you to the border of our lands. Captain James Whitmore and 2 of his men will see you safely to the crossing, where you may continue north into Scotland or west toward Wales as you choose." Relief flooded through Eleanor, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly. An escort meant protection from bandits and worse. It meant she would not have to face the first leg of her journey entirely alone. "Your Majesty is most gracious," she said, her voice steady. "I thank you for this mercy." Edward nodded, then turned to one of his men. "Fetch Captain Whitmore." As they waited, Vivian moved closer to the king, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Your Majesty, surely such consideration is unnecessary. Eleanor is young and capable. She will manage well enough on her own." The king's expression cooled slightly as he looked down at Vivian. "We have made our decision, Lady Vivian. Surely you do not object to us showing what mercy we deem appropriate?" Vivian withdrew her hand immediately, her smile never faltering, though Eleanor could see the frustration in her eyes. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I spoke only out of concern for your men, who might be better employed in your service here at court." "Our men serve where we command them to serve," Edward replied, his tone brooking no argument. A few moments later, a man emerged from the castle barracks and strode across the courtyard. Captain James Whitmore was a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with dark blonde hair that fell just past his collar and eyes of a startling blue that seemed to take in everything at once. His face was strong and angular, marked by a thin scar that ran along his left jaw, a memento from some past battle. He wore a studded leather jerkin over a shirt of chain mail, with a long sword at his hip and a dagger strapped to his thigh. A cloak of dark brown wool hung from his shoulders, practical rather than ornamental. The captain dropped to one knee before the king. "Your Majesty, you summoned me." "Rise, Captain," Edward commanded. "We have a task for you. You are to escort this woman to our northern border. See that she arrives safely and is provided with enough supplies to continue her journey beyond our lands. You will take 2 men of your choosing and depart within the hour." Whitmore rose and turned his gaze to Eleanor for the first time. His expression was carefully neutral, but she thought she detected a flicker of curiosity in those blue eyes. "As you command, Your Majesty," he said. "May I ask the lady's name and the reason for her journey?" "This is Eleanor Ashford," the king said, and Eleanor noticed he did not use the title Lady. "She has been banished from our kingdom and is no longer under our protection once she crosses the border. Your duty is simply to ensure she reaches that point alive and with her possessions intact. The captain's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and Eleanor realized he must know of her case. Everyone at court would have heard of the accusation and her banishment. She braced herself for contempt or disgust, but when Whitmore looked at her again, his expression remained professionally detached. "Understood, Your Majesty. We will leave as soon as I gather my men and supplies." Edward nodded in satisfaction. "See that you do." He turned back to Eleanor, and for just a moment something flickered in his gaze that might have been doubt or regret. But it was gone so quickly that Eleanor wondered if she had imagined it. "Fare you well, Eleanor Ashford. May you find peace in whatever land you choose to make your home." With that, the king mounted his horse and rode out with his hunting party, leaving Eleanor alone in the courtyard with Vivian and the captain. Vivian's expression had darkened considerably, clearly displeased with this development, but she maintained her composure. "I shall leave you to your preparations then," she said coldly. "Goodbye, cousin. I do hope you survive your journey." As Vivian swept away with her ladies trailing behind her, Captain Whitmore approached Eleanor. Up close, he was even more imposing, standing at least a head taller than she, and built like the warrior he clearly was. Yet his manner was courteous, as he inclined his head in a slight bow. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice a pleasant baritone, "I will need perhaps half an hour to gather my men and additional provisions. Will you be ready to depart at that time?" Eleanor nodded. "I have nothing left to prepare, Captain. I will be ready whenever you are." Whitmore studied her for a moment, his blue eyes searching her face. "You seem very calm for someone beginning a journey into exile. Would you prefer I weep and wail?" Eleanor asked, a hint of defiance creeping into her voice. "I have shed all the tears I intend to shed for this place. Now I simply wish to leave it behind." Something that might have been approval crossed the captain's features. A practical attitude. "It will serve you well on the road." He paused, then added, "For what it is worth, I knew your father. Lord Thomas Ashford was a good man and an honorable one. He fought beside my own father during the border wars." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "You knew him?" "I was young, but yes. He spoke often of his daughter, of how proud he was of your intelligence and your kind heart. He would not have believed these accusations against you." Whitmore's voice was quiet, meant only for her ears. Tears threatened again, but Eleanor blinked them away. "Thank you, Captain. That means more to me than you know." Whitmore nodded once, then turned and strode toward the barracks, his movements efficient and purposeful. Eleanor watched him go, feeling a small flicker of hope kindle in her chest. Perhaps she would not face this journey entirely without allies after all. True to his word, Captain Whitmore returned within half an hour, accompanied by 2 soldiers. Both were younger than their captain, perhaps in their early 20s, and both regarded Eleanor with open curiosity. Whitmore introduced them as Peter and Duncan, both competent riders and skilled with blade and bow. They had brought an additional pack horse loaded with supplies and bedrolls. "We will make for the northern border by way of the forest road," Whitmore explained as they prepared to mount. "It is longer than the main highway, but safer from bandits and prying eyes. We should reach the border crossing in 4 days' time if the weather holds." Eleanor mounted her gray mare with practiced ease, settling into the saddle and gathering the reins. "I am ready, Captain." Whitmore swung up onto his own horse, a powerful bay stallion that danced sideways with barely contained energy. He controlled the animal with subtle movements of his legs and hands, demonstrating the kind of expert horsemanship that came from years in the saddle. "Then let us be off. Peter, take the rear. Duncan, ride ahead and scout the road. And Miss Ashford," he added, turning to look at her directly, "stay close to me. I gave the king my word I would see you safely to the border, and I intend to keep it." As they rode out through the castle gates, Eleanor did not look back. She fixed her eyes on the road ahead, on the mist-shrouded forest that awaited them, and tried not to think about everything she was leaving behind. Blackmore Castle, with its cold stone walls and colder inhabitants, faded into the distance. Whatever lay ahead, it could not be worse than what she had already endured. The road wound through rolling hills covered in dying grass and scattered groves of oak and ash trees. The autumn leaves created a carpet of gold and rust beneath their horses' hooves, muffling the sound of their passage. The mist gradually lifted as the morning progressed, revealing a sky of pale gray streaked with lighter clouds. Birds called from the trees, their songs melancholy in the cool air. They rode in silence for the first hour, Eleanor lost in her thoughts and the men focused on their duty. But eventually, Captain Whitmore brought his horse alongside hers, matching her pace. "May I ask you something, Miss Ashford?" he said quietly. Eleanor glanced at him warily. "You may ask, though I cannot promise to answer. Did you do it? Did you try to poison Lady Vivian?" The question was direct and unexpected. Eleanor appreciated the honesty of it, even as it reopened the wound of her false accusation. "No," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I did not. I swear on my parents' graves, and on whatever honor I have left, that I am innocent of the charges against me." Whitmore nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer. "I believe you." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "You do? Why?" "Because I have seen true guilt in men's eyes, and I see none in yours. Because your father was the most honest man I ever knew, and I cannot believe his daughter would be capable of such treachery. And because," he added with a slight smile, "Lady Vivian has a reputation at court for getting what she wants, regardless of who stands in her way." Eleanor stared at Captain Whitmore, scarcely able to believe what she had just heard. In the days since her accusation, no one of any standing had openly declared belief in her innocence. The weight of his words settled over her like a warm cloak, chasing away some of the cold that had taken residence in her bones. "You truly believe me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Whitmore's blue eyes remained steady on hers. "I do, though I confess it matters little in the scheme of things. The king has made his judgment, and I am but a soldier sworn to obey. Believing in your innocence does not change your fate, I fear." "Perhaps not," Eleanor agreed, her fingers tightening on the reins. "But it changes how I feel about facing that fate. To know that someone, anyone, sees the truth means more than you can possibly understand, Captain." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the forest growing denser around them as the road narrowed. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled branches reaching across the path to form a canopy that filtered the weak sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, rich and loamy. Somewhere in the distance, Eleanor could hear the babbling of a stream, its voice a constant companion to their journey. Duncan, the scout riding ahead, suddenly raised his hand in warning. The entire party came to an immediate halt, hands moving instinctively to weapons. Whitmore's expression became hard and focused, all traces of their earlier conversation vanishing as he transformed into the warrior he was trained to be. "What is it?" he called quietly to Duncan. The young soldier pointed ahead to where the road curved sharply around a massive oak tree. "Movement in the trees, Captain. Could be deer, could be men. Can't tell from here." Whitmore turned to Eleanor, his voice low and commanding. "Stay behind me. Peter, guard our rear. Duncan, with me." He drew his sword with a whisper of steel on leather, the blade gleaming dully in the filtered light. Eleanor's heart began to pound, but she kept her mare steady, following Whitmore's instruction to remain behind him as they advanced slowly around the bend. Her hand moved to the small dagger at her waist, though she knew it would be of little use against armed bandits if that was what awaited them. As they rounded the oak, the source of the movement became clear. A small group of travelers huddled beside an overturned cart, its contents spilled across the road. There were 5 of them, a family by the look of it, a man and woman of middle years, 2 young children, and an elderly woman who sat on a fallen log, her face pale with pain. They looked up at the approaching riders with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. Whitmore sheathed his sword and dismounted in one fluid motion. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone gentler than Eleanor had heard it before. The man stepped forward, wringing his cap in his hands. He was dressed in the simple wool tunic and breeches of a farmer or craftsman, his face weathered by sun and wind. "Captain, thank God you've come. We're honest folk traveling to the northern villages to visit my wife's sister. Our cartwheel hit a rut in the road and broke clean through. My mother injured her leg in the fall, and we've no way to continue our journey or repair the damage." Eleanor dismounted as well, ignoring Whitmore's look of surprise. She approached the elderly woman, kneeling beside her to examine the injury. The woman's leg was swollen and discolored, clearly painful, though the bone did not appear broken. "May I?" Eleanor asked gently, and at the woman's nod, she carefully felt along the limb. Her mother had taught her the basics of healing, insisting that a lady should know how to tend to the sick and injured on her estates. "It is badly bruised and possibly sprained, but not broken," Eleanor announced. She looked up at Whitmore. She should not walk on it for several days at least. Do we have bandages and our supplies? Whitmore seemed to assess the situation quickly, his mind clearly working through the options. We do, he said after a moment. Peter fetched the medical kit from the pack horse. He turned to the family's father. Your cart cannot be repaired here, and we cannot spare the time to help you do so. But we can offer you this. We will bandage your mother's leg and leave you enough supplies to camp here safely for a few days. When we reach the next village, we will send back help to collect you. The man's face flooded with relief and gratitude. Bless you, Captain. We had feared we would be left here to the mercy of whatever bandits roam these woods. As Peter brought the medical supplies, Eleanor set to work binding the elderly woman's leg with strips of clean linen, her movements practiced and sure. She could feel Whitmore watching her, but she focused on her task, gently wrapping the injury and securing it with careful knots. The old woman smiled up at her, her eyes kind, despite the pain she must be feeling. You have a healer's touch, my dear, she said softly. Your husband is fortunate to have you. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. I am not married, she said quietly, but my mother taught me that healing is a gift we should all possess, regardless of station. The woman's eyes sharpened with interest. You speak like nobility, yet you travel with soldiers and tend to common folk. There is a story there, I think. Before Eleanor could respond, Whitmore interjected smoothly. We all have our stories, grandmother. Some are best left untold. He helped Eleanor to her feet, his hand warm and steady on her elbow. The bandage is well done. You have skill. Eleanor met his gaze, seeing approval there that made her stand a little straighter. I had a good teacher. They left the family with food, water, and blankets from their supplies, as well as Whitmore's promise to send help from the next settlement. As they rode away, Duncan spoke up for the first time, his voice thoughtful. That was kind of you, miss. Not many nobles would stop to help common folk, let alone treat their injuries with their own hands. Then not many nobles understand what truly matters, Eleanor replied. We are all human beneath our different stations. Pain and suffering recognize no rank. Peter, who had been silent until now, nodded in agreement. My sister says the same. She's a healer in our village, always tending to whoever needs her help, whether they can pay or not. The conversation opened a door that had been closed since their journey began. As they rode, the soldiers began to speak more freely, sharing stories of their families and their lives before joining the king's service. Eleanor learned that Duncan came from a long line of soldiers, his father and grandfather both having served the crown with distinction. Peter had joined the army to escape the grinding poverty of his village, hoping to send money back to his mother and siblings. Both men were good-natured and competent, and Eleanor found herself relaxing in their company. Whitmore remained somewhat more reserved, but even he contributed to the conversation occasionally, sharing tales of his training and the battles he had fought along the northern borders. Eleanor listened carefully, piecing together a picture of a man who took his duties seriously, but who also possessed a strong sense of justice and honor. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, admiring the easy way he sat his horse and the quiet confidence with which he led his men. They made camp that evening in a small clearing just off the road, sheltered by a ring of ancient beech trees whose golden leaves rustled overhead in the evening breeze. Peter and Duncan set about building a fire and preparing their evening meal, while Whitmore tended to the horses, checking each animal's hooves and ensuring they were properly secured for the night. Eleanor helped where she could, gathering firewood and filling their water skins from a nearby stream. As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge in the clear sky above, they sat around the fire eating a simple meal of dried meat, hard cheese, and bread. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the night. The forest around them was alive with sounds: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of a fox. It was beautiful in a way that the castle had never been, raw and honest and real. Tell me about your father, Whitmore said suddenly, his voice quiet in the darkness. If you are willing. Eleanor looked across the fire at him, surprised by the request, but not displeased. She took a moment to gather her thoughts, remembering the man who had shaped so much of who she was. He was a good man, as you said, strong but gentle, fierce in battle but kind in peace. He believed that nobility was not about the blood in your veins, but about the choices you made and the way you treated those who depended on you. She smiled slightly, lost in memory. He used to take me riding through the Ashford estates when I was a child, teaching me the names of all our tenants and insisting I understand their lives and struggles. He said a lord who did not know his people was not worthy of leading them. He sounds like the kind of man we need more of in these troubled times, Whitmore observed. What happened to him? Fever 5 years ago, Eleanor said, her voice catching slightly. It swept through the region that winter, taking him and my mother both within days of each other. I was 18, barely old enough to inherit, certainly not prepared to manage the estates alone. That was when Vivienne came to help me. I thought she was being kind, offering to stay and guide me through my grief and my new responsibilities. I did not realize she was positioning herself to take everything I had. Duncan, who had been listening quietly, shook his head. That is cold, miss. To use someone's grief against them like that. It is the way of the court, Peter added darkly. My sister says that nobles are like wolves, all smiles and courtesy until they smell weakness. Then they strike. Whitmore shot his men a warning look. Careful. You speak of Miss Ashford's world. But Eleanor laughed, a sound tinged with bitterness. No, let them speak. They are right. The court is full of wolves, and I was too naive to see them for what they were. I believed in honor and truth, in the idea that goodness would be recognized and rewarded. I learned the hard way that the world does not work that way. Perhaps not, Whitmore said, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. But that does not mean we should abandon those beliefs. The world needs people who still believe in honor and truth, even if it costs them dearly, especially if it costs them dearly. Eleanor met his gaze across the flames, feeling something shift between them, some understanding that went deeper than words. You sound like my father, she said softly. He used to say something very similar. Then he was wiser than most, Whitmore replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Eventually Whitmore stood and stretched, his tall frame silhouetted against the stars. We should get some rest. We have a long ride tomorrow, and I want to make good time while the weather holds. He turned to his men. Peter, take first watch. Duncan, you will relieve him in 4 hours. I will take the final watch before dawn. What about Miss Ashford? Duncan asked. Should she take a watch as well? Whitmore shook his head. No, she's under our protection, not part of our unit. Let her rest. Eleanor wanted to protest that she was perfectly capable of keeping watch, but she recognized the futility of arguing. Whitmore had made his decision, and she suspected he was not a man who changed his mind easily. Instead, she wrapped herself in her cloak and settled onto the bedroll that Peter had prepared for her, positioning herself as close to the fire as she dared for warmth. Sleep was slow in coming. Eleanor lay staring up at the stars through the canopy of leaves, her mind churning with everything that had happened and everything that lay ahead. She was homeless, titleless, exiled from the only world she had ever known, yet lying here beneath the stars, listening to the crackling fire and the gentle sounds of the forest, she felt a strange sense of peace. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she was finally free of Vivienne's machinations and the poisonous atmosphere of the court. Perhaps it was the presence of Captain Whitmore and his men, who treated her with respect despite knowing she was disgraced. Or perhaps it was simply that she had nothing left to lose, and there was a certain freedom in that. She must have eventually dozed, because she woke sometime later to find the fire burned down to embers and the camp silent, except for the sound of someone moving quietly nearby. She opened her eyes to see Whitmore adding wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life with practiced efficiency. He must have taken over the watch from Duncan. I am sorry, Eleanor whispered. Did I wake you with my moving about? Whitmore looked over at her, surprise flickering across his features. No, you were quite still. I did not realize you were awake. Cannot sleep? Eleanor sat up, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. My mind will not quiet itself. There is too much to think about, too much uncertainty ahead. Whitmore nodded, settling himself on a log near the fire. That is understandable. You have been through an ordeal that would break many people, yet you seem to be bearing it with remarkable strength. I do not feel strong, Eleanor admitted. I feel terrified and lost and angry, but I have learned that showing such emotions only gives your enemies ammunition to use against you. True enough, Whitmore agreed. But you are among friends now, or at least among people who mean you no harm. You do not have to maintain that facade with us. Eleanor studied him in the firelight. This man who had been a stranger mere hours ago, but who now seemed to understand her better than people she had known for years. "Why are you being so kind to me, Captain? You know what I have been accused of. You know I am disgraced and exiled. Why do you treat me as though I still deserve respect?" Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and sincere. "Because I have seen enough of the world to know that accusations are not always true, and disgrace is not always deserved. Because your actions speak louder than any court judgment. The way you help that family today, the way you speak of your father and your beliefs, the way you carry yourself with dignity despite everything that has happened to you. These things tell me who you really are, Miss Ashford, and that person deserves respect, title or no title." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you," she whispered. "You cannot know how much that means to me." They sat together in companionable silence, watching the fire and listening to the forest wake around them. Birds began their morning songs, tentative at first, and then growing bolder, as the sky lightened from black to deep blue to pale gray. Eleanor found herself studying Whitmore's profile in the growing light, noting the strong lines of his jaw, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken at some point, the scar that marked his face like a badge of honor. He was handsome in a rugged way, she decided, but it was more than that. There was an integrity to him, a steadiness that drew her like a moth to flame. As if sensing her scrutiny, Whitmore turned to look at her, and their eyes met. For a heartbeat, neither of them looked away, and Eleanor felt something pass between them, some recognition or connection that made her breath catch. Then Whitmore smiled slightly and looked back at the fire. "Dawn comes," he said quietly. "We should wake the others and prepare to ride. We have much ground to cover today." The second day of their journey dawned cold and clear, with frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Eleanor's breath misted in the air as she helped break camp, rolling her bedding and securing it to her mare's saddle. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and her muscles protested the prospect of another long day in the saddle. But she refused to complain. These men were doing her a kindness by escorting her, and she would not repay them by being a burden. They ate a quick breakfast of oat porridge and dried fruit, then mounted and continued north along the forest road. The trees here grew even thicker, their branches intertwining overhead to create a tunnel of gold and russet leaves. Sunlight pierced through in brilliant shafts, illuminating the morning mist that still clung to the ground in wispy tendrils. The beauty of it took Eleanor's breath away, and she found herself grateful for this journey, despite the circumstances that had necessitated it. She had spent so many years confined within castle walls, attending to the endless ceremonies and machinations of court life. Out here, with the wind in her hair and the open road before her, she felt more alive than she had in years. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when Duncan, scouting ahead as usual, came galloping back with urgency written across his young face. "Captain," he called out, reining in his horse sharply. "There is trouble ahead." A group of men blocking the road, armed and looking for confrontation. Whitmore's expression hardened instantly, his hand moving to his sword. "How many?" "I counted 8, maybe 9. Too many for honest travelers, not quite enough for a proper military patrol. Bandits, I would wager, or deserters looking for easy prey." Eleanor felt her heart sink. This was exactly the kind of danger she had feared when contemplating her exile. A lone woman on the roads would have been helpless against such men. Even with her escort, the odds were not favorable, 8 or 9 against 4, and one of those 4 was a woman with no combat training beyond the most basic use of a dagger. Whitmore turned in his saddle to look at his companions, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. "Peter, take Miss Ashford and circle back to that fork in the road we passed a mile back. Wait there for us. Duncan and I will handle this." "No," Eleanor said firmly, surprising herself with the force of her objection. "I will not hide while you risk yourselves for my sake. There must be another way." "Miss Ashford, this is not a matter for debate," Whitmore said, his tone brooking no argument. "Those men will not hesitate to harm you if given the chance. Your safety is my responsibility, and I cannot protect you and fight them at the same time." "Then do not fight them," Eleanor countered. "Can we not negotiate? Offer them coin to let us pass? I have some money in my purse, and surely avoiding bloodshed is worth the cost." Duncan shook his head grimly. "Begging your pardon, miss, but men like that do not negotiate. They take what they want and kill anyone who resists." Offering them coin will only show them we have valuables worth taking. It would make things worse, not better. Eleanor wanted to argue further, but she could see the logic in their words. She was thinking like a courtier, believing that all conflicts could be resolved through diplomacy and compromise. These men knew the reality of the road, where violence was often the only language understood. Still, the thought of being sent away to hide while others fought on her behalf galled her. Whitmore must have seen the conflict in her face because his expression softened slightly. "I understand your feelings, Miss Ashford. Truly, I do. But please, trust me in this. I have dealt with road bandits before. Duncan and I can handle 9 men, but only if we do not have to worry about protecting you at the same time. Let Peter take you to safety. If we do not return within the hour, he will escort you by another route to the border." The finality in his voice made it clear that further argument would be futile. Eleanor nodded reluctantly, hating the feeling of helplessness that washed over her. "Be careful," she said quietly, her eyes meeting Whitmore's. "Please." Something flickered in those blue depths, something that might have been warmth or appreciation. "I intend to be," he replied. "I made a promise to see you safely to the border, and I always keep my promises." Peter gestured for Eleanor to follow him, and they turned their horses back the way they had come, moving at a quick trot. Eleanor looked over her shoulder once to see Whitmore and Duncan riding forward, their backs straight and their hands resting casually on their sword hilts, as though they were simply continuing their journey rather than riding toward potential death. The sight made her throat tighten with fear, and something else she could not quite name. The fork in the road Peter led her to was little more than a widening in the path, where a smaller trail branched off into deeper forest. He dismounted and helped Eleanor down from her mare, then positioned them behind a thick stand of oak trees, where they could watch the main road without being easily seen. The packhorse stood patiently nearby, laden with their supplies, oblivious to the danger its human companions faced. They waited in tense silence, Eleanor straining her ears for any sound that might indicate what was happening ahead. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. She found herself thinking about Whitmore, about the conviction in his voice when he had spoken of honor and truth, about the way he had looked at her across the campfire the night before. He was a good man, perhaps one of the few truly good men she had ever known, and the thought of him being hurt or killed because of her made her feel physically ill. "How long has it been?" she asked Peter, her voice barely above a whisper. The young soldier checked the position of the sun. "Perhaps 20 minutes, miss. Still time yet before we need to worry." But Eleanor was already worried. 20 minutes felt like an eternity when you did not know what was happening, could not see or hear the outcome of the confrontation taking place somewhere ahead on the forest road. She paced back and forth in the small clearing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, willing the time to pass faster and dreading what news it might bring. Then finally, the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat, and she saw Peter's hand move to his sword. They waited, tense and ready, until 2 riders came into view around the bend. Eleanor nearly collapsed with relief when she recognized Whitmore and Duncan, both sitting tall in their saddles, apparently unharmed. Whitmore dismounted quickly, his eyes scanning Eleanor as though checking for injuries despite the fact that she had been nowhere near the fight. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I should be asking you that question," Eleanor replied, moving closer to examine him for wounds. She could see now that there was blood on his sword, still unsheathed and held loosely in his right hand, and a tear in the shoulder of his leather jerkin. "You are hurt." "Barely a scratch," Whitmore assured her, though he allowed her to inspect the damage. The leather had indeed been cut, but the blade had not penetrated deep enough to cause serious injury. "One of them got lucky with his dagger before Duncan ran him through. It is nothing to concern yourself with." "What happened?" Peter asked, his voice tight with the tension of having been left behind. "Did you have to kill them all?" Duncan shook his head, wiping his own blade clean on a cloth before sheathing it. "Only 3. The rest fled once they realized we were trained soldiers rather than easy marks. Cowards, the lot of them. They talked brave enough when they thought we would be intimidated, but they scattered like rabbits once the captain cut down their leader." Eleanor felt sick at the thought of men dying, even bandits who would have killed them without hesitation. She had lived a sheltered life at court, where violence was hidden behind closed doors and courtly manners. This was the reality of the world beyond castle walls, brutal and unforgiving. "I am sorry you had to do that because of me," she said quietly. Whitmore's expression softened as he looked at her. "You have nothing to apologize for, Miss Ashford. Those men chose their path when they decided to prey on travelers. What happened to them was justice, not murder. And I would do it 1,000 times over to keep you safe." The intensity of his words, the sincerity in his eyes, made Eleanor's breath catch. She found herself unable to look away, held by his gaze as surely as if he had reached out and taken her hand. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Eleanor did not quite understand, but that made her heart race and her skin feel warm despite the cold air. Duncan cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "We should move on, Captain. Those bandits who fled might return with reinforcements, and I would rather not be here if they do." Whitmore nodded, stepping back and breaking eye contact with Eleanor. "You are right. Let us put some distance between ourselves and this place." He helped Eleanor remount, his hand lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary on her elbow, then swung up onto his own horse with fluid grace. They rode hard for the next hour, putting miles between themselves and the site of the skirmish. The forest gradually began to thin, giving way to rolling hills dotted with sheep and the occasional farmstead. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals, and Eleanor could see farmers working in their fields, preparing for winter. It all looked so peaceful, so normal, that it was hard to believe they had just escaped a deadly confrontation. As the afternoon wore on, they came upon a small village nestled in a valley between two hills. It was the kind of place that might have 20 houses if you counted generously, with a single inn that also served as the tavern and gathering place for the community. Whitmore called a halt, deciding they would rest here for the night rather than camp in the open again. The inn was called the Broken Wheel, a reference Eleanor did not understand until she saw the actual broken cartwheel mounted above the door as a sign. The interior was warm and smoky, with a large hearth at one end and rough wooden tables scattered throughout. The innkeeper, a stout woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, looked them over with the practiced assessment of someone who had dealt with travelers of all kinds. 4 rooms, Whitmore said, placing coins on the scarred wooden counter. "And meals for 4, plus feed and stabling for our horses." The innkeeper's eyes lingered on Eleanor, taking in her fine cloak and the quality of her remaining possessions. "We do not get many noble ladies in these parts," she observed. "Traveling far, are you?" "To the border," Whitmore said shortly, his tone discouraging further questions. "The rooms?" The woman shrugged and pocketed the coins. "Upstairs. First 4 doors on the right. Supper will be ready within the hour. Stew and bread. Nothing fancy, but it is hot and filling." Eleanor's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a single window that looked out over the village square. She sank onto the bed gratefully, her body aching from 2 days of hard riding. A basin of water and a cloth had been left on a small table, and she washed the road dust from her face and hands, feeling slightly more human afterward. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Whitmore standing in the hallway, his expression serious. "May I come in?" he asked. "There is something we need to discuss." Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter, suddenly very aware of the intimacy of having a man in her bedchamber, even one who had been nothing but honorable. Whitmore seemed to sense her discomfort because he left the door open and positioned himself near the window, maintaining a respectful distance. "I have been thinking about your situation," he began without preamble, "about what happens when we reach the border tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Eleanor felt a jolt of surprise. "I thought you said 4 days to the border." "I did, but that was following the main road and taking a leisurely pace. After the encounter with those bandits, I decided we should take a more direct route and travel faster. We will reach the crossing by tomorrow evening if we ride hard." Whitmore paused, his blue eyes searching her face. "Which brings me to what I wanted to discuss. What are your plans once you cross into Scotland? Do you have family there? Friends who might take you in?" Eleanor shook her head slowly, the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. "I have no one. My mother's family is all gone, and my father's relations are distant cousins I have never met. I thought perhaps I might find work in one of the larger towns, as a healer or a teacher. I can read and write in 3 languages, and I know enough of medicine to be useful." Whitmore's frown deepened. "Miss Ashford, forgive me for speaking plainly, but that is a dangerous plan. A woman alone, even one with your skills, will be vulnerable to all manner of threats. The roads are not safe, and towns can be just as perilous if you have no protection or patronage. What choice do I have? Eleanor asked, hearing the edge of desperation in her own voice. I cannot return to England, and I have no means to travel anywhere else. I must make do with what I have. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor could see him wrestling with some internal decision. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as though he were choosing each one with great care. There may be another option. My family has an estate in the Highlands, a day's ride north of the border. It is remote and not particularly grand, but it is safe and well protected. My mother lives there with my younger sister. They could use someone with your skills and education. My sister is 16 and in need of refinement that our isolated location has not provided. You could serve as her companion and tutor if you were willing. Eleanor stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. You would do that for me? Offer me a place in your family's home knowing what I have been accused of? I told you I do not believe those accusations, Whitmore said firmly. And even if I had doubts, which I do not, you have more than proven your character over these past 2 days. My mother is a good judge of people. If I tell her you are trustworthy, she will accept you without question. It would solve the problem of what becomes of you after tomorrow, and it would ease my conscience considerably. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, overwhelming gratitude flooding through her chest. For days she had been consumed with fear and uncertainty about her future, imagining herself alone and destitute in a foreign land, struggling to survive with no resources and no protection. Now this man, this stranger who owed her nothing, was offering her salvation in the form of a home and a purpose. Captain Whitmore, I do not know what to say. This kindness is more than I could ever have hoped for. Then say yes, Whitmore replied, a slight smile touching his lips. Say you will accept the position and allow me to take you to my family's estate. It would bring me great peace of mind to know you are safe and cared for, rather than wandering Scotland alone and vulnerable. Eleanor wanted to accept immediately, to seize this lifeline with both hands and never let go. But years of courtly training made her hesitate, made her consider all the implications of such an arrangement. What will people say? She asked quietly. A disgraced exile living under your family's roof? Will that not bring shame upon your house? Whitmore's expression hardened slightly. Let them say what they will. The Scottish Highlands are far from the English court and its poisonous gossip. No one there will know or care about accusations made by a vengeful cousin in a foreign kingdom. You will simply be Miss Ashford, tutor and companion to my sister Margaret. That is all anyone needs to know. The practicality of his words, the matter-of-fact way he dismissed the concerns that had dominated her life at court, was both refreshing and slightly disorienting. Eleanor realized she was still thinking like a courtier, worried about reputation and appearances, when those things no longer held any power over her life. She was free now, free to make her own choices and forge her own path, even if that freedom had come at a terrible price. Then yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Yes, Captain Whitmore, I accept your generous offer with profound gratitude. I will do everything in my power to be a credit to your family and to earn the trust you are placing in me. Whitmore's smile widened, transforming his usually serious face into something warmer and more approachable. Excellent. That is settled then. And please, when we are in private conversation, call me James. All this Captain Whitmore formality seems rather ridiculous given the circumstances. James? Eleanor repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It felt intimate somehow, a small bridge across the gulf of station and circumstance that separated them. And you must call me Eleanor. I am no longer Lady Ashford, and titles seem rather pointless when one has been stripped of everything they represent. Eleanor? James said softly, and the way he spoke her name sent an unexpected warmth through her body. It suits you better than any title ever could. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with something Eleanor could not quite name. It was not the calculated flirtation of the court, where every glance and word was a move in an endless game of advancement and advantage. This was something more honest, more real, and infinitely more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. A knock at the door broke the spell. Peter's voice called out, "Captain, the innkeeper says supper is ready. Shall we gather in the common room?" James cleared his throat and stepped back, the professional soldier reasserting himself. "We shall be down shortly." he called back. He turned to Eleanor, offering his arm in a gesture that was both courtly and practical. "Shall we? I find I'm ravenous after the day's excitement." Eleanor took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the leather and wool. They descended the narrow stairs to the common room, where Duncan and Peter had already claimed a table near the hearth. The warmth from the fire was welcome after the chill of the autumn evening, and the smell of the stew was mouth-watering. The innkeeper brought them bowls of thick venison stew rich with vegetables and herbs, along with fresh bread still warm from the oven and mugs of dark ale. Eleanor ate with an appetite she had not felt in days, the simple food tasting better than the finest dishes served at court. Perhaps it was the fresh air and exercise, or perhaps it was the relief of knowing her immediate future was secure. But everything seemed more vivid and real here in this humble inn than it ever had in the great halls of Blackmore Castle. As they ate, Duncan and Peter regaled them with stories from their time in the king's service, tales of battles fought and mischief undertaken during long stretches of peace. Eleanor found herself laughing genuinely for the first time since her accusation, the sound surprising her with its lightness. James watched her with an expression of quiet satisfaction, as though her laughter was a gift he had not expected but deeply appreciated. When the meal was finished and the ale had warmed them all thoroughly, James stood and stretched. "We should retire early," he announced. "Tomorrow will be a long day, and I want to reach the Whitmore estate before dark. The mountain roads can be treacherous after sunset, even for those familiar with them." Eleanor retired to her small room, her mind buzzing with thoughts of what tomorrow would bring. She would cross into Scotland, leaving England and all its painful memories behind. She would meet James's family and begin a new life as a tutor and companion, a role so different from the one she had been born to that it seemed almost unreal. But most of all, she would be near James, would see him regularly when he visited his family, would have the opportunity to know him better and understand the connection she felt growing between them. She undressed down to her shift and climbed beneath the rough quilt, expecting to lie awake for hours as she had the previous nights. But exhaustion claimed her quickly, pulling her into a deep and dreamless sleep that lasted until the first light of dawn crept through her window. The next morning brought gray skies and a cold wind that promised rain before the day was done. They broke their fast quickly with oat porridge and apples from the inn's stores, then mounted and set out while the village was still barely stirring. The road climbed steadily now, leaving the gentle valleys behind and heading into more rugged terrain. Rocky outcroppings began to appear alongside the path, and the trees grew more sparse and windswept. They rode hard throughout the morning, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and stretch their legs. The border crossing, when they finally reached it in the early afternoon, was an unremarkable thing. Just a stone marker beside the road and a small guard post manned by a single bored-looking soldier who waved them through without more than a cursory glance. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy as they passed that marker. She was free of England now, beyond the reach of King Edward's justice and Vivian's machinations. But she was also severed from everything familiar, cast adrift in a new land with only the kindness of near strangers to sustain her. The Scottish countryside was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that the cultivated lands of southern England could never match. The hills rolled away in every direction, covered in heather and bracken that glowed purple and gold in the weak sunlight. Streams rushed down rocky slopes, their water crystal clear and icy cold. In the distance, Eleanor could see mountains rising against the sky, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "It is beautiful," she breathed, turning in her saddle to take it all in. James, riding beside her, smiled with obvious pride. "Wait until you see the Highlands proper. This is nothing compared to what awaits us further north. My family's estate sits in a glen between two mountains, with a loch that reflects the sky like polished silver. It is the most beautiful place I have ever known." They continued north, the road growing steadily more rough and narrow as they climbed higher into the hills. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and cold stone. Eleanor pulled her cloak tighter, grateful for its warmth. The clouds that had threatened all day finally made good on their promise, and a cold rain began to fall, light at first but quickly growing heavier. "There is a shepherd's hut about a mile ahead," James called out over the sound of the rain. "We can shelter there until the worst passes." They urged their horses into a faster pace, the rain now coming down in sheets that obscured visibility and soaked through even the heaviest wool. By the time they reached the small stone structure James had mentioned, They were all thoroughly drenched and shivering. The hut was little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a dirt floor and a crude fireplace in one corner, but it was dry and out of the wind. Duncan and Peter immediately set about building a fire with wood that had been stored in the hut for this very purpose. James helped Eleanor dismount, his hands warm and steady on her waist, despite the cold rain that streamed down his face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes searching hers with concern. "Just cold and wet," Eleanor replied, her teeth chattering slightly. "Nothing that a fire will not remedy." Within minutes, Duncan had a blaze going in the fireplace, and they all huddled around it gratefully. The horses were secured under a rough overhang attached to the side of the hut, protected from the worst of the weather. Steam began to rise from their wet clothes as the heat from the fire worked its magic. "We may need to wait here for some time," James said, peering out at the deluge beyond the doorway. "These mountain storms can last for hours, and the road will be dangerous until it passes. Better to be patient now than risk the horses on slick stones." Eleanor nodded, settling herself as comfortably as she could on the dirt floor near the fire. She was acutely aware of James sitting close beside her, so close that their shoulders nearly touched. The small space of the hut forced an intimacy that would have been scandalous at court, but felt natural here, born of necessity and the shared adversity of the weather. As the storm raged outside, they talked. James told her more about his family, about his mother, Lady Catherine Whitmore, who had been widowed 10 years ago when his father fell in battle against raiders from the north. He spoke of his sister Margaret with obvious affection, describing her as spirited and intelligent, but lacking the polish and education that her station deserved. "She is wild as the highland winds," he said with a fond smile, "but there is goodness in her, and a quick mind that hungers for knowledge. I think you will like each other very much." Eleanor, in turn, told him more about her life before the accusation, about the lonely years after her parents' deaths when she had tried to manage the Ashford estates while navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. She spoke of her love for learning, for books and music and the healing arts. She described the gardens at Ashford Manor, where she had spent countless hours among the roses and herbs, finding peace in the growing things. "You miss it," James observed, watching her face as she spoke. "I miss what it represented," Eleanor corrected. "Home, security, a place where I belonged. But I do not miss the court itself, or the constant need to guard every word and gesture. There is something liberating about having nothing left to lose. It makes honesty possible in a way it never was before." James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that. I have always preferred the straightforward nature of military life to the intricacies of court. In battle, you know who your enemies are. They are the ones trying to kill you. At court, everyone smiles while sliding daggers between your ribs." They fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the rain drum against the roof and the crackle of the fire. Duncan and Peter had moved to the far side of the hut, giving their captain and Eleanor what privacy the small space allowed. Eleanor found herself studying James's profile in the firelight, admiring the strength of his features and the intelligence in his eyes. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her, whether he viewed her merely as a responsibility to be discharged, or if he felt even a fraction of the attraction that was growing within her own heart. As if sensing her gaze, James turned to look at her. Their eyes met and held, and Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. James lifted his hand slowly, as though giving her time to object, and gently brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm despite the cold. "Eleanor," he said softly, her name a question and a promise all at once. She knew she should pull away, should maintain the proper distance that her new position in his household would require. But she found she could not move, could not break the spell of this moment. Instead, she leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. James's other hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle and reverent. He leaned closer, and Eleanor's eyes began to drift closed in anticipation. But at the last moment, James pulled back, his expression conflicted. "Forgive me," he said roughly. "That was inappropriate. You are to be part of my family's household, under my protection. I should not take advantage." Eleanor felt a wave of disappointment wash over her, followed by understanding and a grudging respect for his restraint. He was right, of course. Any romantic entanglement between them would complicate her position and potentially compromise the sanctuary he was offering. but knowing he was right did not make her want him any less. "There is nothing to forgive," she said quietly, though her heart ached with what might have been. "You have shown me nothing but honor and kindness, James. That will not change because of a moment's impulse." James nodded, but Eleanor could see the same conflict in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. They sat in silence for a while longer, the moment both broken and somehow deepened by what had almost happened. When the rain finally began to ease, they rose and prepared to continue their journey, both carefully maintaining the proper distance that duty and propriety demanded, even as something stronger pulled them toward each other. The Whitmore estate came into view just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Eleanor's first glimpse of what would be her new home took her breath away. The manor house was built of gray stone that seemed to grow naturally from the rocky hillside, its walls thick and sturdy against the harsh Highland weather. It was not as grand as Blackmoor Castle or even Ashford Manor, but there was a beauty to it that spoke of strength and endurance, of a family that had weathered centuries in this wild and beautiful place. The house sat at the edge of a loch whose waters reflected the colored sky like a mirror, creating the illusion that the world existed twice, once above and once below. Mountains rose on either side of the glen, their peaks already crowned with snow that glowed pink in the dying light. Smoke rose from several chimneys, promising warmth and comfort within. Around the main house clustered several outbuildings, stables, and storage structures, and beyond those Eleanor could see fields and pastures where sheep grazed peacefully. "Welcome to Whitmore Glen," James said, his voice filled with unmistakable pride and affection. "It may not be a palace, but it has been home to my family for 8 generations. Every stone, every timber, carries the history of those who came before us." As they rode down the sloping path toward the house, Eleanor could see people emerging to greet them. A woman stood on the front steps, tall and elegant despite her simple gown of deep blue wool. Her hair, more silver than brown, was arranged in a neat braid that hung over one shoulder, and her face, though lined with age and experience, held an undeniable beauty. This could only be Lady Catherine Whitmore, James's mother. Beside her stood a younger woman, slim and vibrant with dark hair that tumbled in unruly curls past her shoulders. She wore a riding dress of green wool, practical rather than fashionable, and her face was alight with excitement at the arrival of visitors. Margaret, Eleanor thought, recognizing James's sister from his descriptions. They dismounted in the courtyard, and James immediately went to his mother, embracing her warmly. "Mother, it is good to see you. You are looking well." Lady Catherine returned the embrace, then stepped back to study her son with a mother's critical eye. "You look tired, James. And is that blood on your jerkin? What trouble have you found this time?" "Nothing I could not handle," James assured her. He turned to Eleanor, gesturing for her to come forward. "Mother Margaret, I would like you to meet Miss Eleanor Ashford. Eleanor, this is my mother, Lady Catherine Whitmore, and my sister Margaret." Eleanor curtsied deeply, suddenly nervous under the scrutiny of these 2 women whose home she was about to invade. "Lady Whitmore, Miss Margaret, I am honored to make your acquaintance. Your son has been extraordinarily kind to me, and I hope I can prove worthy of the trust he has placed in me." Lady Catherine's sharp eyes took in everything about Eleanor in a single sweeping glance, from her travel-stained clothing to the quality of her remaining possessions to the way she held herself with unconscious grace despite her obvious exhaustion. James sent word ahead by messenger that he was bringing a guest, though his letter was rather cryptic about the circumstances. "Please come inside out of the cold. You must be frozen and famished after your journey. We can discuss everything properly once you have had a chance to warm yourself and rest." Margaret, less restrained than her mother, bounded forward with enthusiasm. "Oh, how wonderful! We so rarely have visitors, and never anyone near my own age. Are you truly going to be my tutor and companion? James's letter said you were educated in languages and music and all manner of interesting things. You must tell me everything about yourself. Where are you from? How did you meet my brother?" "That is such a lovely cloak. Is it lined with rabbit fur? I have never owned anything so fine." "Margaret," Lady Catherine said firmly, though there was affection in her tone, "allow the poor girl to catch her breath. There will be time enough for questions once she has settled in." The interior of Whitmore Manor was warm and welcoming, with thick rugs covering the stone floors and tapestries hanging on the walls to keep out the drafts. A large hearth dominated the main hall, with a fire blazing cheerfully and several comfortable chairs arranged around it. The furnishings were well made but not ostentatious, speaking to a family that valued quality and comfort over display. A servant appeared to take Eleanor's cloak and show her to a room where she could refresh herself before the evening meal. The chamber she was given was on the second floor, with a window that looked out over the loch. It was simply furnished with a bed larger and more comfortable looking than the one she had left behind at Blackmore. A wardrobe, a writing desk, and a washstand with a basin and pitcher of warm water. Someone had already laid a fire in the small hearth, and the room glowed with welcoming warmth. Eleanor washed the worst of the travel dust from her face and hands, then attempted to bring some order to her hair. She changed into her one remaining good gown, a deep green wool with darker embroidery at the cuffs and neckline. It was not as fine as the dresses she had worn at court, but it was clean and presentable, and it made her feel slightly more prepared to face James's family. When she descended to the main hall, she found the family already gathered. James had changed as well, trading his travel-stained clothes for a clean tunic of midnight blue over dark breeches and boots. His hair was still damp from washing, and he looked more relaxed than Eleanor had ever seen him, as though being home had lifted some weight from his shoulders. Dinner was served in a dining room that was cozy rather than grand, with a table that could seat perhaps 12 people comfortably. Tonight there were only the 5 of them. Lady Catherine at the head of the table, James to her right, Margaret to her left, and Eleanor beside Margaret, with Duncan and Peter having been given their meal in the kitchen with the household staff. The food was simple but excellently prepared: roasted venison with herbs, root vegetables glazed with honey, fresh bread, and a berry tart for dessert. Wine was poured, dark and rich, warming Eleanor from the inside as the fire warmed her from without. As they ate, Lady Catherine gently but persistently drew out Eleanor's story, asking questions with the skill of someone long accustomed to extracting information without seeming intrusive. Eleanor found herself telling the older woman everything: her parents' deaths, Vivian's arrival and slow insinuation into her life, the false accusation of poisoning, the trial before King Edward, and finally her banishment. She left nothing out, knowing that these people deserved the full truth if they were to accept her into their home. Lady Catherine listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each revelation. When Eleanor finally fell silent, Lady Catherine sat back in her chair and regarded her seriously. "That is quite a tale, my dear. And you swear that these accusations were entirely false? That you played no part in any attempt to harm your cousin?" "I swear it on everything I hold sacred," Eleanor replied firmly. "Lady Vivian orchestrated the entire scheme to steal my inheritance. She poisoned herself with just enough to make her ill without causing lasting harm, then planted evidence in my chambers and bribed my maidservant to testify against me. I am innocent of all charges, though I have no way to prove it." "I believe her," James interjected quietly. "I have spent several days in her company now, and I have seen nothing but honor and kindness from her. She helped a family of strangers on the road, tending to an injured woman with skill and compassion. She showed courage when we encountered bandits, and grace when facing an uncertain future. These are not the actions of a poisoner or a schemer." Margaret, who had been listening with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. "Of course she is innocent. Anyone can see that Lady Vivian is the villain in this story. How awful to betray family in such a way. Poor Eleanor." She reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand sympathetically. Lady Catherine smiled slightly at her daughter's passionate declaration, then turned her attention back to Eleanor. "I am inclined to agree with my children's assessment. You have an honest face and an open manner that speaks well of your character. Moreover, any woman who could inspire such loyalty and protection from my son, who is normally quite circumspect in his judgments, must have considerable merit. You are welcome in this house, Eleanor, for as long as you wish to stay. We will speak no more of accusations and exile. Here, you are simply Eleanor Ashford, tutor and companion to Margaret, and a valued member of our household." The relief that washed over Eleanor was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She had not realized how much she had feared being rejected, turned away to face the world alone after all. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You cannot know what this means to me. I promise I will work hard to earn my place here, and to be worthy of your trust." "I have no doubt of it," Lady Catherine replied warmly. "Now, let us speak of more pleasant things. Margaret, why do you not tell Eleanor about your studies and interests, so she knows what she will be working with?" Margaret needed no further encouragement. She launched into an enthusiastic description of her education thus far, which had been somewhat haphazard given their remote location. She had learned to read and write from her mother, and had studied some history and mathematics from books in the family library. But she hungered for more. Languages, particularly French and Latin, music beyond the simple tunes she could pick out on the old lute in the music room, and knowledge of the wider world beyond their highland glen. "I want to learn everything," Margaret declared passionately. "I want to read the great philosophers and poets, to understand the movements of the stars, to speak languages that would allow me to converse with scholars from distant lands. Is that terribly ambitious of me?" Eleanor smiled, seeing something of her younger self in this vibrant, curious girl. "Not at all. Ambition in pursuit of knowledge is never a fault. I will be honored to help you learn whatever you wish to study. I may not be a scholar of the first order, but I have had excellent teachers, and I will share everything I know with you." They talked late into the evening, the conversation flowing easily among the four of them. Lady Catherine proved to be intelligent and well-read, with opinions on everything from estate management to the political situation in both England and Scotland. Margaret was full of questions about life at court, about the fashions and customs and intrigues that seemed so exotic from her perspective in the isolated Highlands. And James, when he spoke, did so with a quiet wisdom that revealed depths Eleanor had only begun to glimpse during their journey. Eventually, Lady Catherine rose from the table, declaring that they had all had a long day and should retire. "Eleanor, you must be exhausted. Margaret will show you back to your room. Tomorrow we can begin to establish a routine for your lessons and your place in the household. But tonight, simply rest and allow yourself to feel safe. You are home now, my dear, and no harm will come to you within these walls." Margaret linked her arm through Eleanor's as they climbed the stairs together, chattering happily about all the things they would do together. "I am so glad you are here," she confided as they reached Eleanor's door. "It gets terribly lonely sometimes, with only Mother and the servants for company. James visits when he can, but his duties keep him away more often than not. Having you here will be like having the sister I always wished for." Eleanor felt her heart warm at the girl's open affection. "I am glad to be here too, Margaret, more than you know. I look forward to our lessons together." After Margaret had bid her good night and departed to her own room, Eleanor prepared for bed in a state of quiet wonder. Just days ago, she had been a condemned exile facing an uncertain and frightening future. Now she had a home, a purpose, and people who seemed genuinely pleased to have her among them. It felt almost too good to be true, as though she might wake to find it all a dream. She was just about to extinguish her candle when a soft knock came at her door. Opening it, she found James standing in the hallway, still dressed but with his collar loosened and his hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it. "I apologize for the late hour," he said quietly. "I wanted to check on you, to make sure you have everything you need." "I have more than I need," Eleanor assured him. "Your family has been incredibly welcoming. I cannot thank you enough for bringing me here, James. You have saved my life in more ways than one." James stepped closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to him. "You should not thank me yet," he said, his voice low and intense. "Having you here, seeing you every day, knowing you are so close and yet maintaining the proper distance that our situations require, it is going to be the most difficult thing I have ever done." Eleanor's breath caught at the raw honesty in his words. "James, we should not speak of this. You were right earlier, in the shepherd's hut. Any feelings between us would only complicate things." "I know," James agreed. "My head knows it with perfect clarity, but my heart seems to have its own ideas on the matter." He reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that sent shivers up her arm. "I am not a man given to romantic notions, Eleanor. I am a soldier, practical and disciplined. But from the moment I saw you standing in that courtyard, facing exile with your head held high, something shifted inside me. And these past days traveling with you, talking with you, watching you face every challenge with courage and grace, that feeling has only grown stronger." Eleanor knew she should pull her hand away, should step back and close the door between them, but she found herself moving closer instead, drawn to him like a moth to flame. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I have tried not to, tried to tell myself it is just gratitude or the intensity of our shared journey. But it is more than that, James. Much more." For a long moment, They stood there in the doorway, hands clasped, eyes locked, the air between them crackling with tension and possibility. Then James lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the gesture achingly tender. "Sleep well, Eleanor," he said softly. "Dream of better days ahead, when perhaps the obstacles between us might not seem so insurmountable." He released her hand and stepped back, and Eleanor watched him walk down the hallway to his own room, her heart pounding, and her skin still tingling where his lips had touched. She closed the door and leaned against it, her mind whirling with emotions she could not fully name. This was dangerous, she knew. This growing attachment to James Whitmore could only lead to heartache and complications, but knowing that did not make her feel it any less intensely. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that brought Eleanor a peace she had not known since before her parents' deaths. Her days were filled with teaching Margaret, who proved to be an eager and intelligent student with an almost insatiable curiosity. They spent mornings working on Latin and French, afternoons on history and literature, and evenings on music, with Eleanor teaching the girl to play the harp that had sat gathering dust in the music room for years. Margaret blossomed under the attention and structured learning, her natural intelligence finding direction and purpose. She absorbed knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain, asking insightful questions that often challenged Eleanor to think more deeply about subjects she had taken for granted. The girl had a particular fascination with the great queens of history, women who had wielded power and shaped kingdoms, and Eleanor found herself researching late into the night to satisfy Margaret's appetite for these stories. Lady Catherine proved to be a warm and supportive presence, treating Eleanor not as a servant but as a valued member of the household. They often took tea together in the afternoons when lessons were done, discussing everything from estate matters to philosophy, to the complex political situations brewing in both England and Scotland. Eleanor discovered that the older woman had a sharp mind and a wealth of experience that made her conversation both enlightening and enjoyable. But it was James's presence, or rather his frequent absence, that dominated Eleanor's thoughts more than she cared to admit. He had returned to his duties with the King's forces just 3 days after bringing her to Whitmore Glen, and though he sent letters regularly, Eleanor felt his absence like a physical ache. His letters were carefully worded, speaking of his duties and asking after his family's welfare. But occasionally there would be a line that seemed meant only for her, a reference to their conversations during the journey or a question about her studies with Margaret that revealed he thought of her more often than propriety might dictate. Eleanor responded to these letters with equal care, maintaining appropriate formality while allowing small glimpses of her own feelings to show through. She told him about Margaret's progress, about his mother's kindness, about the beauty of the glen as winter settled over the highlands with its blanket of snow, and she tried not to think too much about the way her heart leapt whenever one of his letters arrived, or how she read and reread them until she had memorized every word. It was nearly 2 months after her arrival when a messenger arrived at Whitmore Glen, bearing news that sent the household into a flurry of activity. King Edward was planning a winter progress through the northern territories, visiting loyal lords and assessing the state of his defenses along the Scottish border. He would be stopping at several estates in the region, and while Whitmore Glen was not on the official itinerary, there was always the possibility that he might visit if he heard that Lady Catherine Whitmore kept a fine house and generous table. "We must prepare," Lady Catherine declared, her organizational skills immediately snapping into action. "The house must be cleaned from top to bottom, the best linens aired, the larders stocked. If His Majesty should honor us with a visit, we must be ready to receive him with all the hospitality befitting his station." Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach at the news. King Edward, the man who had banished her from England, might be coming to the very house where she had found sanctuary. If he discovered her here, living comfortably under the protection of one of his own captains, what might he do? Would he see it as a betrayal by James? Would he extend his judgment to include the entire Whitmore family? Margaret noticed Eleanor's distress and squeezed her hand comfortingly. "Do not worry," she whispered. "Mother will not allow any harm to come to you. And James would never have brought you here if he thought the king's visits posed a real danger." But Eleanor could not shake her unease. That evening, when she and Lady Catherine were alone in the drawing room, she voiced her concerns. "My lady, perhaps it would be best if I removed myself from the household until the king's progress has passed. I would not want my presence here to cause difficulties for your family." Lady Catherine looked up from her embroidery, her expression firm. Nonsense. You will do no such thing. This is your home now, Eleanor, and we do not cast out family members because of inconvenient visitors. Besides, the king has never met you personally, has he? He saw you only that once in his great hall, and you were dressed far differently then. Your hair was styled elaborately. You wore court finery. You carried yourself as a noble lady. Now you dress simply, you wear your hair in a practical braid, and you are known as Miss Ashford, tutor and companion. I very much doubt he would recognize you, even if he did visit, which is far from certain. Eleanor wanted to believe her, but fear gnawed at her heart. She had seen the king's sharp eyes, the way he missed nothing. But Lady Catherine had made her decision, and Eleanor had no choice but to trust in it, and hope that either the king would not visit, or that if he did, her changed circumstances would provide sufficient disguise. 3 days later, a letter arrived from James, brought by a rider who had nearly killed his horse, getting it to Whitmore Glen with all speed. Lady Catherine opened it with trembling fingers, her face going pale as she read. When she finished, she looked up at Eleanor and Margaret, who waited anxiously to hear the news. James writes that he has learned something of great importance regarding Eleanor's situation, Lady Catherine said slowly. He has been investigating the circumstances of her accusation, making quiet inquiries among the servants and courtiers at Blackmore Castle. He has found a witness, a kitchen maid who saw Lady Vivian mixing something in a cup the night before she fell ill. The girl is willing to testify that Vivian drank whatever she had prepared herself, with no involvement from Eleanor. Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. A witness? Someone who can prove my innocence? Lady Catherine nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Yes, but there is a complication. The girl is frightened and refuses to come forward unless she can be guaranteed protection from Vivian's retribution. James is trying to arrange safe passage for her, but it will take time. In the meanwhile, he warns us that he has heard rumors that the king may indeed visit Whitmore Glen during his progress. He asks that we be cautious and keep Eleanor's presence here as quiet as possible. The news was both thrilling and terrifying. The possibility of proving her innocence, of clearing her name and perhaps even reclaiming her inheritance, made Eleanor's head spin with hope. But the immediate danger of the king's potential visit cast a shadow over that hope, making it feel fragile and uncertain. The household's preparations intensified over the following days. Every room was scrubbed until it shone, every piece of silver polished to a mirror brightness, every tapestry beaten free of dust. The larders were stocked with preserved meats and fruits, wheels of cheese, sacks of grain, and barrels of the finest ale and wine. Lady Catherine oversaw it all with the precision of a general marshalling troops for battle. Eleanor threw herself into helping with the preparations, partly to be useful and partly to keep her mind occupied. She and Margaret spent long hours in the kitchens, helping to prepare the elaborate pastries and confections that might be served if the king did visit. The work was hard but satisfying, and Eleanor found comfort in the simple, tangible nature of it. It was during one of these kitchen sessions that Margaret broached a subject that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Eleanor," she said carefully, not looking up from the dough she was kneading, "may I ask you something rather personal?" Eleanor glanced at the younger girl, noting the slight flush on her cheeks. "Of course. You may ask me anything." Margaret took a deep breath. "Are you in love with my brother?" The question caught Eleanor so off guard that she nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. "Margaret, what would make you ask such a thing?" "I am not blind," Margaret replied, finally meeting Eleanor's eyes. "I see how you look when one of his letters arrives. I notice how carefully you compose your replies, writing and rewriting until the words are exactly right. And I saw the way he looked at you that first night, when he thought no one was watching. He has never looked at anyone that way before, Eleanor. Not ever." Eleanor set down her bowl and took a moment to compose her thoughts. She had known that her feelings for James were growing, had acknowledged them to herself in the quiet hours of the night. But hearing them spoken aloud by someone else made them feel more real and more dangerous. "Your brother has been extraordinarily kind to me," she said carefully. "He saved me from a terrible fate and brought me to a home where I have found safety and purpose. It would be only natural for me to feel gratitude and affection for him. That is not what I asked." Margaret persisted gently. "I asked if you love him." Eleanor met the girl's eyes and saw only genuine concern and curiosity there. no judgment or disapproval. She made a decision to be honest. Yes, she admitted quietly. I do love him, though I have no right to, and nothing can come of it. He is a captain in the king's service, a man of honor and duty. I am a disgraced exile living in his family's home under their protection and charity. Any romantic attachment between us would be inappropriate and could damage his reputation and career. Margaret's face broke into a wide smile. Oh, Eleanor, you do not understand at all. James does not care about such things. He has never been one to worry about what others think or to let society's rules dictate his choices. If he loves you, and I believe he does, then he will find a way to be with you. You will see. Eleanor wanted to share the girl's optimism, but years of navigating court politics had taught her that good intentions and genuine feelings were often not enough to overcome the barriers of station and circumstance. Perhaps, she said non-committally, but for now we must focus on more immediate concerns. If the king visits and discovers who I am, none of these other questions will matter. As if summoned by her words, a commotion arose in the courtyard. The sound of many horses and shouting men carried through the thick walls of the manor. Eleanor and Margaret rushed to the window, their hearts pounding with dread. In the courtyard below, a column of soldiers was dismounting, their armor gleaming dully in the weak winter sunlight. At their head rode a figure Eleanor would have recognized anywhere. King Edward himself, tall and imposing on his great destrier, his dark cloak billowing in the cold wind. "He is here," Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with fear. "The king is here." Margaret grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Do not panic. Remember what Mother said. You look nothing like the Lady Eleanor Ashford who stood trial at Blackmore. You are simply Miss Ashford, my tutor. Keep your head down, speak only when spoken to, and all will be well." But Eleanor's heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. She watched as Lady Catherine emerged from the house to greet the king, her posture perfect and her face composed in a welcoming smile that revealed none of the surprise she must be feeling at this unexpected visit. The king dismounted and accepted her greeting with royal grace, and even from this distance, Eleanor could see him surveying the manor and its grounds with those sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing. "Come," Margaret said, tugging at Eleanor's hand. "We should go to our rooms and stay out of sight until Mother sends for us. The less you are seen, the better." They hurried up the back stairs to the upper floor, their hearts pounding. Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. What if the king asked to meet all the members of the household? What if he recognized her despite her changed appearance? What if someone mentioned her name within his hearing? She spent the next hours in an agony of suspense, listening to the sounds of activity below as the king and his retinue were welcomed and settled. Servants rushed back and forth, bringing refreshments and preparing chambers for the royal guests. Through her window, Eleanor could see more soldiers arriving, setting up a temporary camp in the fields beyond the manor house. It appeared the king intended to stay for more than just a brief visit. As evening approached, a knock came at Eleanor's door. She opened it to find one of the household maids, a friendly girl named Annie. "Begging your pardon, miss, but Lady Catherine requests your presence in the drawing room. The king has expressed a desire to meet all the members of the household." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. This was exactly what she had feared. "Did Lady Catherine say why the king wishes to meet everyone?" Annie shrugged. "I could not say, miss. But you had best hurry. Lady Catherine said to bring you down as soon as I found you." Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She checked her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand, making sure her hair was neatly braided, and her simple gray gown was presentable. She looked nothing like the elaborately dressed noblewoman who had stood before the king in judgment. She had to believe that would be enough. Eleanor descended the stairs with trembling legs, each step feeling like she was walking toward her doom. The drawing room doors stood open, and she could hear voices within, the king's deep tones unmistakable even from a distance. She paused just outside, gathering what courage she could, then stepped through the doorway. The room was warm from the blazing fire, and several people were gathered around it. King Edward stood near the hearth, still wearing his traveling clothes of dark leather and wool, though he had removed his heavy cloak. Lady Catherine sat in her usual chair, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert. Margaret stood beside her mother, and to Eleanor's shock and relief, James was there as well, dressed in his captain's uniform, his presence unexpected but deeply welcome. All eyes turned to Eleanor as she entered. She dropped into a deep curtsy, keeping her head bowed and her eyes lowered. "Your Majesty," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ah, this must be the tutor I have heard about," the king said, his voice carrying that note of authority that commanded attention. "Rise, girl. Let me see you." Eleanor straightened slowly, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain everyone in the room must hear it. She could feel the king's eyes on her, studying her with that penetrating gaze that had stripped away so many courtiers' pretenses. "What is your name?" Edward asked. "Eleanor Ashford, your Majesty," she replied, the words catching slightly in her throat. There was no point in lying about her name when it would be easily discovered. The king was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor could feel his scrutiny intensifying. "Ashford," he repeated thoughtfully. "That name is familiar to me. Have we met before?" Eleanor's mind raced. She could lie, but if he discovered the deception, it would make everything worse. She could admit the truth and throw herself on his mercy, or she could try to deflect without outright dishonesty. "I do not believe so, your Majesty," she said carefully, "though my family once held lands in your kingdom. Perhaps you knew my father, Lord Thomas Ashford." "Ah yes, Thomas Ashford. A good man, as I recall. Died of fever some years back, along with his wife." The king paused. "And they had a daughter, did they not? I seem to recall some scandal involving her not long ago." The room fell silent, tension thick enough to cut. Eleanor felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to remain standing, to meet whatever came with as much dignity as she could muster. It was James who spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Your Majesty, if I may explain. Miss Ashford is indeed the woman who was accused of poisoning her cousin and subsequently banished from your kingdom. I encountered her on the road during her exile and, knowing her father's reputation and finding her circumstances questionable, I offered her sanctuary in my family's home as a tutor for my sister." The king's eyes narrowed and he turned his full attention to James. "You knowingly harbored an exile from our justice? A woman we had banished from our lands?" "She was beyond your lands when I offered her sanctuary, your Majesty," James replied evenly. "We are in Scotland now, and she broke no law by accepting shelter here. Moreover, I have spent considerable time investigating the circumstances of her conviction, and I have found compelling evidence that she was falsely accused." Edward's expression darkened dangerously. "You presume to question our judgment, Captain Whitmore?" "I presume to seek justice, your Majesty, as you yourself have taught your soldiers to do." James's voice remained respectful but firm. "I have found a witness who can testify that Lady Vivian Ashford poisoned herself and planted evidence to frame her cousin. The witness is a kitchen maid named Sarah Blackwood, currently in hiding for fear of Lady Vivian's retribution, but willing to testify before your court if granted protection." The king's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, Eleanor thought he might order them all arrested. But then something shifted in his expression, a flicker of what might have been doubt or perhaps curiosity. "These are serious allegations, Captain. You accuse a noblewoman of perjury and conspiracy before the crown." "I accuse her of nothing, your Majesty. I simply present evidence that I believe warrants further investigation." "The witness I mentioned can provide testimony that was not available during the original trial. Surely justice demands that all evidence be considered, even if it comes to light after a judgment has been rendered." Lady Catherine spoke then, her voice carrying the weight of her years and status. "Your Majesty, I have known this girl for 2 months now. She has lived under my roof, taught my daughter, and conducted herself with honor and integrity in all things. I pride myself on being an excellent judge of character, and I tell you with absolute certainty that Eleanor Ashford is incapable of the crime she was accused of. If there is new evidence that might prove her innocence, surely your sense of justice would compel you to examine it." Edward turned to look at Eleanor again, his gray eyes searching her face. "What say you, Eleanor Ashford? Do you maintain your innocence even now, months after our judgment?" Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. Fear still coursed through her veins, but beneath it was a core of steel, forged by everything she had endured. "I do, your Majesty. I swear on my parents' graves and on my own soul that I never attempted to harm Lady Vivian. She orchestrated the entire plot to steal my inheritance, and she succeeded because I was too trusting and too naive to see the trap she was laying until it had already closed around me." "I have paid dearly for that naivety, but I will not compound it by confessing to crimes I did not commit." The king studied her for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned back to James. "This witness you speak of, where is she now?" "In a safe house near the border, Your Majesty. I can have her brought to your court within a week if you grant her safe passage and immunity from any reprisals." Edward paced to the window, looking out over the snow-covered glen. The room remained silent, everyone waiting for his decision. Eleanor felt James's eyes on her, offering silent support, and she drew strength from his presence. When the king finally turned back to face them, his expression was thoughtful rather than angry. "We find ourselves in an unusual situation. We rendered judgment based on the evidence presented to us, and that judgment was carried out. Eleanor Ashford was banished, and she left our lands as commanded. Technically, she has fulfilled the terms of her sentence. However, if new evidence exists that might exonerate her, we cannot in good conscience ignore it." He paused, his gaze moving from James to Eleanor to Lady Catherine. "Here is our decision. Captain Whitmore, you will retrieve this witness and bring her to our court at Blackmore Castle. We will hear her testimony in full, and we will also question Lady Vivian Ashford more thoroughly about the circumstances of her poisoning. If the evidence supports Miss Ashford's claims of innocence, we will issue a full pardon and restore her titles and properties. However, if the evidence does not support her innocence, or if we find that this witness has been coached or bribed, then Miss Ashford will face more severe punishment than mere banishment." Eleanor felt her breath catch. It was a chance, perhaps her only chance, to clear her name and reclaim her life, but it was also a terrible risk. If something went wrong, if the witness changed her testimony, or if Vivian had somehow covered her tracks more thoroughly than James realized, Eleanor could face execution rather than exile. "Do you accept these terms?" the king asked, looking directly at Eleanor. Eleanor glanced at James, seeing encouragement in his eyes, then at Lady Catherine, who gave a small, supportive nod. She turned back to the king and spoke clearly. "I do, Your Majesty. I accept your terms, and I welcome the opportunity to prove my innocence before your court." "Very well." Edward gestured to James. "Captain Whitmore, you have 1 week to produce this witness. We will remain in the north visiting the border fortifications, and then return to Blackmore. See that you and your witness are there when we arrive." James bowed deeply. "It shall be done, Your Majesty." The king nodded, then his expression softened slightly. "We have always valued justice above all else, even when it means admitting that we may have been mistaken. If you are indeed innocent, Eleanor Ashford, then you have suffered a grave injustice, and we will make amends. But if you are guilty, or if this is some elaborate deception, the consequences will be severe. Do you understand?" "I understand, Your Majesty," Eleanor replied, "and I thank you for this opportunity to prove the truth." Edward turned to Lady Catherine. "We thank you for your hospitality, Lady Whitmore. We will take our leave in the morning and continue our progress. In the meanwhile, we would be honored if you would join us for supper and share news of the Highlands." The tension in the room eased considerably as the conversation shifted to less fraught topics. Lady Catherine graciously agreed to dine with the king, and Margaret was permitted to join them as well. Eleanor excused herself, claiming the need to prepare the next day's lessons for Margaret, though in truth she simply needed to escape the king's presence and try to process everything that had just happened. She had barely reached her room when James appeared at her door, his expression intense. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. As soon as the door closed behind him, she found herself pulled into his arms, his embrace fierce and protective. "I was terrified," she whispered against his chest. "When he asked my name, when I thought he recognized me, I was certain everything was over." "I know," James murmured into her hair. "But you were magnificent, Eleanor. The way you stood before him and maintained your innocence with such conviction, even knowing the risks. I have never been more proud of anyone in my life." Eleanor pulled back slightly to look up at him, seeing the depth of emotion in his blue eyes. "What if the witness does not testify as you expect? What if Vivian has found a way to silence her or discredit her testimony? Then we will find another way," James said firmly. "I will not let you face execution, Eleanor. I swear it on my life. If necessary, we will flee to the continent, to somewhere beyond Edward's reach. But I truly believe it will not come to that. The witness I found is credible, and she has no reason to lie. She hates Vivian for forcing her to give false testimony against you in the first place. She wants to make things right." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but fear still gnawed at her. And if I am pardoned, if my innocence is proven and my titles restored, what then? I will be Lady Ashford again, with estates to manage and a position at court. You are a captain in service to the king, bound by duty and honor. Where would that leave us? James cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses from years of sword work. It would leave us free to acknowledge what we both feel. Eleanor, I love you. I have loved you since that first day when I saw you refuse to be broken by exile and disgrace. I love your courage, your intelligence, your compassion, and your strength. If you are pardoned and restored, I will ask for your hand in marriage, and I will count myself the most fortunate man alive if you say yes. Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. I love you too, James. I have tried not to. Tried to tell myself it was impossible, but my heart would not listen. Yes, if all this comes to pass as we hope, yes, I will marry you and count myself the most fortunate woman alive. James kissed her then, a kiss that held all the passion and longing they had both been suppressing for weeks. It was tender and fierce at once, a promise and a claim, and Eleanor felt herself melt into it, into him, letting herself believe for the first time that perhaps happiness was not impossible after all. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, James rested his forehead against hers. I leave tomorrow to fetch the witness, he said quietly. I will ride as hard as I can and be back within the week. While I am gone, stay here where you are safe. Do not return to England until we can do so together with the king's full blessing. I will wait for you, Eleanor promised. However long it takes, I will wait. They stood together in the fading light, holding each other and taking comfort in the closeness, knowing that the days ahead would test them both. But for this moment, they had each other, and that was enough. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering everything in a glittering blanket. Eleanor rose early and watched from her window as the king's party prepared to depart. Edward himself rode at the head of the column, his bearing regal even in traveling clothes. James rode near the king, and though he did not look up at Eleanor's window, she felt connected to him across the distance. As the party rode out of sight, Lady Catherine came to stand beside Eleanor. He will succeed, the older woman said confidently. My son has never failed in a mission he undertook, and he will not fail in this. Your name will be cleared, Eleanor. I feel it in my bones. Eleanor wanted to share her certainty, but doubt lingered. So much could go wrong. So many things were beyond their control. But she nodded and tried to smile. I pray you are right, my lady. The week that followed was the longest of Eleanor's life. She threw herself into teaching Margaret, using the lessons as a distraction from her constant worry. They studied history and languages, practiced music until their fingers were sore, and took long walks around the loch despite the bitter cold. Margaret, understanding Eleanor's need for distraction, asked endless questions and kept up a steady stream of chatter that prevented too much brooding. On the 6th day, a messenger arrived from James. The letter was brief but encouraging. He had retrieved the witness, and they were traveling south toward Blackmore Castle. The woman, whose name was indeed Sarah Blackwood, had confirmed everything James had hoped. She was prepared to testify that she had seen Lady Vivian mixing a powder into her own wine, and that Vivian had then ordered Sarah to claim she had seen Eleanor doing something similar. Sarah had only agreed because Vivian had threatened to have her entire family arrested for theft if she refused. 2 days after receiving James's letter, another messenger arrived at Whitmore Glen, this one bearing the royal seal. Lady Catherine opened it with trembling fingers, her face growing pale as she read. When she looked up at Eleanor, her expression was a mixture of triumph and vindication. "The king commands your presence at Blackmore Castle," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The witness has testified, and King Edward wishes to address the matter of your conviction personally. Eleanor, my dear, he has asked that you come to hear his judgment." Eleanor felt her knees go weak, and she sank into the nearest chair. This was it, the moment that would determine the course of her entire future. Either she would be exonerated and restored, or she would face an even harsher punishment than exile. "When must I leave?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Immediately," Lady Catherine replied. "The king is at Blackmore now, and he wishes to resolve this matter before he returns south. I will send Duncan and Peter to escort you, and Margaret and I will accompany you as well. You will not face this alone, Eleanor. We are your family now, and families stand together. The journey south to Blackmore Castle took 3 days of hard riding. Eleanor spent those days in a state of suspended anxiety, her mind racing through every possible outcome. Lady Catherine and Margaret did their best to keep her spirits up, talking of optimistic futures and James's certain success. But Eleanor could not shake the fear that gripped her heart. They arrived at Blackmore Castle on a gray afternoon, the stone walls looking more forbidding than ever against the leaden sky. As they rode through the gates, Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The last time she had been here, she had left in disgrace, banished and alone. Now she was returning, but whether as a pardoned innocent or a condemned criminal remained to be seen. They were met in the courtyard by James himself, who helped Eleanor dismount with hands that lingered just a moment longer than necessary on her waist. His eyes searched her face, and she saw relief there mixed with determination. "The witness testified before the king this morning," he said quietly, for her ears alone. She was brave and convincing, Eleanor. She told the truth exactly as it happened, and she did not waver even under Lord Blackwood's harsh questioning. "And the king?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does he think?" "He has summoned Lady Vivian to appear before him this evening," James replied. "He will hear both testimonies side by side and render his final judgment. You are to attend as well, to answer any questions he may have." Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of what was to come settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She allowed herself to be led inside, to a small chamber where she could refresh herself and change into the one fine gown Lady Catherine had insisted she bring. It was a deep burgundy velvet, similar in color to the one she had worn on the day of her first judgment, but richer in fabric and more elegantly cut. Lady Catherine had commissioned it secretly, insisting that Eleanor must look every inch the noble lady she truly was when she faced the king again. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, a guard came to escort Eleanor to the great hall. She walked through the corridors with her head held high, refusing to show the fear that churned in her stomach. Lady Catherine and Margaret walked beside her, their presence a source of strength. James had gone ahead to take his place with the other officers and nobles who would witness the proceedings. The great hall was packed with courtiers, far more than had been present at her original trial. Word had spread that the king was reconsidering the Ashford case, and everyone wanted to witness this unusual turn of events. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers that followed in her wake. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with curiosity, and still others with the cruel anticipation of those who enjoyed watching others' downfalls. King Edward sat upon his throne, his expression grave and thoughtful. To his right stood Lord Blackwood, looking considerably less confident than he had at Eleanor's original trial. To his left stood a young woman Eleanor did not recognize, dressed simply but neatly. This must be Sarah Blackwood, the witness who had found the courage to speak the truth. And there, standing before the dais with 2 guards flanking her, was Vivian. Eleanor's cousin looked as beautiful as ever in a gown of midnight blue silk, but there was a tightness around her eyes and mouth that spoke of strain. When she saw Eleanor enter, her expression flickered between shock and poorly concealed fury. Eleanor took her place opposite Vivian, the 2 women facing each other across the open space before the throne. The murmur of voices in the hall died away as the king rose to his feet. "We are gathered here this evening to address a matter of grave importance," Edward began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Several months ago we rendered judgment in the case of Lady Eleanor Ashford, who was accused of attempting to poison her cousin, Lady Vivian Ashford. Based on the evidence presented at that time, we found Eleanor guilty and sentenced her to banishment from our kingdom. However, new evidence has come to light that calls our original judgment into question." The king gestured to Sarah Blackwood. "This woman, Sarah, who served as a kitchen maid in this very castle, has come forward with testimony that contradicts what she told us during the original trial. Sarah, please repeat for this assembly what you told us this morning." Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice clear. "Your Majesty, I lied during Lady Eleanor's trial. Lady Vivian forced me to give false testimony, threatening to have my entire family arrested for theft if I refused. The truth is that I never saw Lady Eleanor mixing any potions or behaving suspiciously. What I did see was Lady Vivian herself, in the still room late one night, mixing a powder into a cup of wine. She drank it herself, then went to her chambers. The next day she was ill, and she told me that if anyone asked, I was to say I had seen Lady Eleanor preparing strange mixtures in the night. A collective gasp went through the assembled crowd. Vivian's face went white, then red with fury. "This is absurd," she cried. "This girl is obviously lying, probably bribed by Captain Whitmore or by Eleanor herself. Your Majesty, you cannot possibly believe such a transparent fabrication." Edward held up his hand for silence. "We are not finished, Lady Vivian. We have also had our physicians examine the vial of poison that was supposedly found in Eleanor's chambers. They have determined that the substance within is a mixture designed to cause temporary illness, not death. The dose would make someone violently sick for a few days, but would not cause lasting harm. This seems an odd choice for someone truly intent on murder, does it not?" "Perhaps Eleanor did not wish to kill me outright," Vivian argued desperately. "Perhaps she merely wished to make me suffer, or to test the poison before using a larger dose. Or perhaps," the king continued, his voice growing harder, "you mixed that poison yourself, took just enough to make yourself ill without serious danger, and then planted the rest in Eleanor's chamber to incriminate her. Tell us, Lady Vivian, why were you so eager to have your cousin convicted? What did you stand to gain from her downfall?" Vivian's composure was cracking, her beautiful face twisting with anger and fear. She had everything that should have been mine: the Ashford estates, the title, the respect. My mother was the elder sister, yet Eleanor inherited simply because her father was the heir. It was not fair. It was never fair. "So you admit it," Eleanor said quietly, her voice cutting through Vivian's tirade. "You admit that this was all about the inheritance, about taking what you felt you deserved regardless of law or right or family loyalty." Vivian turned on her, all pretense of innocence abandoned. "Yes, I admit it. You were too stupid and too naive to appreciate what you had. You spent your time with books and healing herbs, caring about peasants and servants as though they mattered. You never understood the power that came with the Ashford name and wealth. I would have used it properly, would have elevated our family to new heights at court. Instead, it was wasted on you." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Lord Blackwood looked appalled, clearly having had no idea that Vivian would confess so openly. Even the king seemed taken aback by the venom in Vivian's voice. Edward raised his hand again, and silence fell. "Lady Vivian Ashford," he said, his voice cold with displeasure, "you have confessed before this court to perjury, conspiracy, and false accusation. You deliberately poisoned yourself and then framed an innocent woman for the crime, causing her to be stripped of her titles and banished from her homeland. These are crimes of the gravest nature, striking at the very heart of justice itself." He turned to Eleanor, and his expression softened slightly. "Eleanor Ashford, we owe you a profound apology. We rendered judgment based on false evidence and lies, and in doing so, we perpetrated a grave injustice against you. We hereby declare you innocent of all charges. Your titles and properties are restored to you in full, along with all rights and privileges that were taken from you. Furthermore, we order that all debts and rents collected from the Ashford estates during your exile be returned to you with interest." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and vindication and overwhelming gratitude. She sank into a deep curtsy, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you for seeking the truth and for making this right." Edward nodded, then turned his attention back to Vivienne, whose face had gone ashen. "As for you, Lady Vivienne, your crimes demand severe punishment. However, we are not without mercy. You will be stripped of all titles and properties. The lands you temporarily held will revert to Lady Eleanor, their rightful owner. You will be banished from our kingdom, never to return upon pain of death. Furthermore, you will make a public confession of your crimes and a formal apology to Lady Eleanor before you leave our lands. This is our final judgment." Vivian opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. She had lost everything, just as she had sought to make Eleanor lose everything. The symmetry of it was not lost on anyone in the hall. Guards stepped forward to escort Vivian away, but before they could reach her, she turned to Eleanor one last time. "You have won," she said bitterly. "I hope you enjoy your victory, cousin. But remember this: you may have your lands and your title back, but you have lost years of your life that you can never reclaim. In that, at least, I succeeded in hurting you." Eleanor met her cousin's gaze steadily. "You did hurt me, Vivian. You took my home and my security and forced me into exile. But in doing so, you also freed me from the poisonous world of court intrigue and introduced me to people of genuine honor and kindness. You helped me discover my own strength and resilience, and you brought me to the man I love. So yes, you hurt me, but you also, unknowingly, gave me gifts more valuable than any estate or title. For that, I almost thank you." Vivian's face contorted with rage and frustration, but the guards were already leading her away. Eleanor watched her go, feeling not triumph but a profound sadness for what her cousin had become, for the bitterness and envy that had consumed her so completely. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with excitement over the dramatic revelations, James made his way through the throng to Eleanor's side. He took her hand in his, no longer caring who saw or what they might think. "You are free," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "You are vindicated and restored, and the whole kingdom knows the truth." Eleanor looked up at him, seeing her own joy and relief reflected in his eyes. "I could not have done this without you, James. You believed in me when no one else did. You risked your career and your reputation to seek the truth. I owe you everything." "You owe me nothing," James replied. "But if you are willing, I would ask you for something nonetheless." He dropped to one knee right there in the great hall, in front of the king and the assembled court, still holding her hand. "Eleanor Ashford, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I know I am merely a soldier, while you are now a great lady with estates and position. But I love you with all my heart, and I swear I will spend every day of my life trying to make you as happy as you have made me." Eleanor felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but these were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Yes, James Whitmore, I will marry you. And you are not merely a soldier. You are the most honorable man I have ever known, and I count myself blessed beyond measure that you love me." James rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her soundly to the cheers and applause of the watching crowd. Even King Edward smiled, nodding his approval of the match. Lady Catherine and Margaret rushed forward to embrace Eleanor, both of them weeping with happiness. "I knew it would all work out," Margaret declared, hugging Eleanor tightly. "I told you my brother would find a way." The king approached them, and they all turned to bow. "It seems we will be gaining a most excellent captain and losing him to matrimony all at once," Edward said with dry humor. "Captain Whitmore, we release you from your current duties, so that you may attend to your new responsibilities as Lord Ashford's husband. The estates will need a strong hand to manage them properly after months of neglect." "I will manage them myself, Your Majesty," Eleanor interjected gently. "With James as my partner and advisor, of course. But the Ashford estates are my heritage and my responsibility. I will not shirk that duty." Edward looked at her with new respect. "Spoken like a true lady of the realm. Very well. We wish you both great happiness. And Lady Eleanor," he added, his voice softer, "we are truly sorry for the injustice you suffered. If there is anything within our power to grant you as recompense, you need only ask." Eleanor considered for a moment, then spoke carefully. "There is one thing, Your Majesty. Sarah Blackwood, the woman who found the courage to speak the truth despite her fear. I would ask that she be rewarded for her bravery and given a position of trust, perhaps as a lady's maid in a noble household, where she will be treated well and valued." Edward nodded approvingly. "A generous request, thinking of others even in your moment of triumph. It shall be done. Sarah will be placed in a good household and compensated handsomely for her truthful testimony." Over the following weeks, Eleanor and James worked together to restore order to the Ashford estates. They found that Vivian had neglected the lands badly, extracting as much profit as possible, while investing nothing in maintenance or improvements. The tenants were relieved and overjoyed to have Eleanor back, many of them expressing their belief that she had been innocent all along. The wedding was held on a bright spring day, with the cherry trees in bloom and the air sweet with the scent of flowers. It took place at the small chapel on the Ashford estate, with Lady Catherine and Margaret in attendance, along with Duncan and Peter and many of the local tenants who had known Eleanor since she was a child. King Edward sent his blessing along with a generous gift, and even sent Lord Blackwood to represent him at the ceremony, though the advisor looked distinctly uncomfortable throughout the proceedings. Eleanor wore a gown of cream silk embroidered with gold thread, her auburn hair crowned with a circlet of spring flowers. James stood waiting for her at the altar in his finest clothes, his face alight with love and pride. As she walked down the aisle toward him, Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness, of having finally found her way home after a long and difficult journey. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but the love behind them was anything but ordinary. When James slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her as his wife, Eleanor felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. All the pain and fear and uncertainty of the past months fell away, replaced by the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. The celebration that followed was joyous and heartfelt, with music and dancing and feasting that lasted well into the night. Margaret caught the bridal bouquet and declared that she would find a love as true as her brother and new sister had found. Lady Catherine wept happy tears and welcomed Eleanor officially into the Whitmore family. Even the usually stoic Duncan and Peter were seen dancing with village girls and singing along to the merry tunes. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, James and Eleanor slipped away to the manor house gardens, seeking a moment of quiet together. They walked hand in hand among the roses that Eleanor's mother had planted years ago, now in full bloom and filling the air with their sweet perfume. "Are you happy?" James asked, pulling Eleanor close against his side. Eleanor looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, then at the manor house where she had been born and raised, and finally at the man beside her, the man who had saved her and believed in her and loved her when she had nothing left to give. "I am more than happy," she said softly. "I am blessed beyond anything I ever dreamed possible. Vivian sought to destroy me, to take everything I had and leave me with nothing. But in her cruelty, she unknowingly led me to you, to a love I never would have found if I had remained safely ensconced in my comfortable life. She meant it for evil, but somehow it all worked toward good." James kissed the top of her head, his arms tightening around her. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes to me. I will protect you, cherish you, and stand beside you through whatever challenges we face. This I swear." "And I swear the same to you," Eleanor replied. "We will build a life together, James, a life filled with love and purpose and meaning. We will manage these estates with wisdom and compassion. We will raise children who know the value of truth and honor, and we will never forget the lessons we learned through all of this hardship." They stood together in the garden as the first stars emerged, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had fought for truth and justice, and won. Eleanor thought briefly of Vivian, somewhere in exile, bitter and alone. She felt pity for her cousin, but no anger. Vivian's hatred had consumed her, had driven her to terrible acts that had ultimately led to her own downfall. Eleanor chose a different path, one of forgiveness and moving forward, rather than dwelling in bitterness. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. There would be challenges, certainly. Managing the estates, navigating the complex politics of the realm, raising a family in uncertain times. But they would face it all together, bound by love and sustained by the unshakable foundation of trust and mutual respect they had built. As they turned to walk back to the manor house where their wedding guests awaited, Eleanor looked back one last time at the gardens, at the home she had lost and found again, at the life that had been stripped away and restored. She had been unjustly accused and banished, had suffered exile and uncertainty and fear, but she had also discovered her own strength, had found true love, and had learned that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest dawns. James squeezed her hand gently. "Ready to begin our new life together, Lady Whitmore?" Eleanor smiled, her heart full to overflowing. "I have never been more ready for anything in my life." And hand in hand, they walked toward their future, toward a life built on love and truth, toward the happiness they had both fought so hard to achieve. The story that had begun with betrayal and injustice had ended with vindication and joy, proving that even in the darkest times, hope and love could prevail.